All right, 6:01. Forgot to close the door to the room. That cost me just enough time to make me late. I'm sorry for the delay, folks. All right, I hope everyone had a good break. I know I had a delicious Culver's bacon cheeseburger with ketchup and mayonnaise as a condiment. I know that makes me a little weird, but I've always liked that from the Burger King burgers, so I thought, why not? So it's become my thing. And if you put mustard on a hamburger, please don't tell me, because I'll lose all respect for you. Excuse me. Take a quick drink of tea here. All right, let's get back to it. Okay, we're at the end of the recess. The start time is 5:01, and we're starting with Ms. Kim is bringing it back on record. Now we'll start with Mr. Cummings. Mr. Strozk, welcome. Thank you, sir. Again, there's that question mark. In your experience, are criminal targets considered innocent until they are proven otherwise? Yes. And your job is to search for evidence or proof of their guilt. Is that right? Guilt or innocence? Yes. Or innocence. And if you don't find evidence of their guilt, ultimately what do? You let them go. You close the investigation. So in most investigations, even before the last witness has been interviewed, do investigators and prosecutors discuss whether there's enough evidence to charge a case with a search for additional evidence, whether those searches for additional evidence are successful? Yes. Yes? In your experience, when in the life cycle of a case do these discussions start? They start very early on. The initial allegation, one of the first discussions with prosecutors, involve, what violations might be at issue and what the elements of those crimes are. And it continues throughout the case. Cummings. So even before the last witness has been interviewed, do investigators and prosecutors typically discuss the chances of success for a potential case, not just an indictment, but a trial? Yes, that's a fair statement. So that's not unusual. It's not unusual. That's correct? I'm sorry if that's getting annoying, but that's how it's written. So I'm not going to, make up things. If it has a question mark on the end of it, I'm going to hit that inflection. Mr. Cummings, and is the amount of probative evidence that has been discovered in the investigation a relevant metric in those discussions? Yes. Was Secretary Clinton's knowledge and intent key to the FBI's recommendation not to charge her? Yes. Why was the lack of evidence or intent fatal to the case? Again, I would defer to, as I've said, I'm not an attorney, but I would defer to the expert attorneys at both the FBI and the Department of Justice. But in the historic, my understanding of how statutes have been used with regard to the mishandling of classified information, those have been done in the context of the knowledge of the individual was always an element of those prosecutions. And in the case of Midyear, in the case of this investigation, the Department of Justice, as well as the FBI, took a very exhaustive look at all the times that this statute had been applied and charged with regard to the mishandling of classified information and developed a series of criteria, one of which certainly was the knowledge or the intent of the person who did it, and that was a critical element. And that is a complete, made-up bit of case law, as we've discussed several times now. Intent is not part of the statute. That is a false inclusion made to get Hillary off the hook. So when did you first understand that the evidence of Secretary Clinton's intent would be the linchpin to the charging decision? I don't know that I would characterize it as the linchpin. I would say that we understood, maybe not so much the linchpin, but one of the significant hurdles we had was being able to demonstrate through evidence that we knew she had an intent or a desire to knowingly violate any of the statutes that we were looking at. So is it safe to say you were looking for evidence of intent early on and in the document reviews and in the interviews? Yes. Throughout? Now, sir, did you ultimately find sufficient evidence of Secretary Clinton's knowledge and intent to recommend charging a criminal case against her? Not that was consistent with past use of the statutes by the Department of Justice? And how is that so significant? Well, it's past use. It's significant because there is a process. We have a way in which the laws are applied by the Department of Justice. We seek to do that in a manner that is blind. It does not take into account a person's position or race or sex or anything of that nature. And the consistency of that practice is one of the hallmarks of the rule of law. Now, did you investigate this matter as aggressively as you would any other matter? Yes. Did you investigate with the same determination to make a case as in any other matter? Yes. And it's good he's asking that. He's answering that with a question mark because, as we've proven over and over again, it's complete bullshit. Mr. Cummings, can you point to two specific instances where you investigated the matter aggressively and with the goal of finding relevant evidence to make a case? Absolutely. I'm sorry, how generic can you get? Basically, has he ever done his job? That's fascinatingly stupid. Strozk, absolutely. There are any number of them. And, you know, there was frequently a disagreement between the Department of Justice and the Bureau. My experience is typically that agents tend to be more aggressive than prosecutors because we're approaching things a little differently. But with regard to this specific case, there are any number of things. Probably one of the primary examples are Secretary Clinton gave the body the corpus of her emails to attorneys to sort through. Right. She didn't give them to the FBI. She gave them to her attorneys and allowed them to separate what they wanted the FBI to see from what they didn't want the FBI to see. The corpus of her emails to attorneys to sort through to determine what was work-related and what wasn't. We came to know that those laptops existed, and we had investigative concerns that the sort process had not been rigorous, that there might have been things that it missed, and that there might be Cummings. How did you come to that conclusion? Strozk. That was what was told to me by our forensic examiners, by our analysts and our agents. As they looked through the body of emails that we had, we found work-related emails through a host of material that we had obtained by consent or via search warrant, in some cases that were not amongst the material that Secretary Clinton had produced as work-related email. One of the hypotheses by, and I forget who it was, but one of the great members of this extraordinary team was that it was possible that just the mechanics of the sort process used had been faulty. And our desire was to, A, those laptops at one time had all the emails on them, B, that by getting that, we could go through and ensure that we did have all of the work-related emails by Secretary Clinton and not just the ones that she had provided for us. Certainly, whether it was a, inadvertent or poorly designed search or what, if there was some nefarious purpose and not to turn things some over, I'm speaking too long. No, actually, you're getting to the heart of it, that it was a completely corrupt process and that you guys were blocked from getting most, if not nearly all, of the true crimes that were on those laptops and on the server that had been deleted. Strozk continues. The takeaway is that we felt strongly that we needed to get those laptops. Defense counsel disagreed vehemently. They viewed them as protected by a variety of privileges, and the Department of Justice initially didn't think that we should pursue that. But the entire team, advocated aggressively that these were essential to our understanding of the case and that we needed to get that material before we could conclude with a sense of legitimacy and completeness that we had gotten or looked at every possible place that those emails might exist. Yeah, legitimacy and completeness, but not, what's the word I'm looking for? Quickness, intensity. Seeing as how you slow-rolled the investigation of the Wiener laptop for how many weeks. But I'm sure that, that didn't matter. He said it didn't matter because sometimes it takes longer than other times to review a computer or a laptop. So, it didn't matter. That's his words, not mine. Mr. Cummins, well, when did your team complete the review of the emails? Sir, I would have to go back and check the record. That's I don't know without access to the file. It was prior to the interview with Secretary Clinton for sure. It was sometime in the spring of 2016, if memory serves correctly. Cummings, did those emails, Goldman, 17? Strozk, 16. 16. A year, 2017, 2016, 2016. Cummings, did those emails reveal any, quote, smoking gun, unquote, evidence of Secretary Clinton's intent? No. When did your team interview the individuals who had sent Secretary Clinton classified information in her emails? That's a lot of S sounds. Strozk, that took place throughout the course of the investigation. There was no set period where we went out and interviewed them. We identified as best we could the authors of every piece of classified information and went out and talked to them about how the material came to be placed into those emails. And in those interviews, did you come up with any smoking gun? No. Did the investigation ever yield smoking gun evidence of Secretary Clinton's intent? No. That's ridiculous. Again, intent is not necessary, but 2, she set up a fucking private server to get around Freedom of Information Act requests through federal records keeping protocol. How can that not be intent? She deliberately set up a private email server to use for work-related emails not being sent through a secure system, but through a private system that was hacked. How can you say there was no intent? Again, it doesn't even matter if there was or not, but still, it's patently obvious there was intent. By putting up that server, there's intent. I'll back up a little bit. Did the investigation ever yield smoking gun evidence of Secretary Clinton's intent? No? It's Cummings. Now, Strozk. Congressman, if I can back up to that last question. When you say smoking gun, I am taking that to mean, did we find any evidence that she acted with ill intent to do what she did? And that's how I'm responding to that question. Cummings, yes, yes. Strozk, yes, sir? God, this is irritating. Mr. Cummings, the Inspector General report states, and this is kind of a long quote, so listen carefully. Our review found that the mid-year team concluded beginning in early 2016 that evidence supporting a prosecution of former Secretary Clinton or her senior aides was likely lacking. This conclusion was based on the fact that the mid-year team had not found evidence that former Secretary Clinton or her senior aides knowingly transmitted classified information on unclassified systems because 1, classified information exchanged in unclassified emails was not clearly or properly marked, and 2, State Department staff introducing classified information into the emails made an effort to, quote, talk around it, end of quote. Is this conclusion consistent with your experience on this case? The fact that her staff were talking around classified information to keep it from being flagged, that's not intent? Jesus. Is this conclusion consistent with your experience on this case? Strozk, it is. I would add there are probably even further characteristics that created problems from any prospective prosecution, but I agree with the statements in that paragraph you just read. Okay. To be very clear, at this point in early 2016, when the team had examined much of the body of evidence but had not found evidence of intent, did the team stop looking for evidence of intent? No. At this point in 2016, when the team had examined much of the body of evidence but had not found evidence of intent, did the team stop examining the evidence or interviewing pertinent witnesses? No. We kept going? At this point in early 2016, when the team had examined much of the body of evidence but had not found evidence of intent, did the team stop conducting effective and aggressive interviews to solicit evidence of intent? No. Looking at the Hillary interview alone, I've already talked about all the times the previous interviewees lied and were given a pass, and then given immunity. Looking at all those aside, putting those off to the corner, the Hillary Clinton interview was a joke. Wasn't even recorded. They don't normally record FBI interviews, I understand, but this was kind of important, right? I mean, it's the freaking Secretary of State. Former. You think they'd get it right. I mean, look up in the discussion of it in Lisa Page's testimony. All of the extra personnel that were allowed to be there, including Clinton's quote-unquote lawyers, who were also witnesses in the case. Yeah, that was... Yeah, they stopped examining the evidence or interviewing pertinent witnesses. Maybe they didn't stop examining, but they certainly didn't do their job. Strozk, no. We kept going? At this point in early 2016, when the team had examined much of the body of evidence, but had not found evidence of intent, did the team stop conducting effective and aggressive interviews to solicit evidence of intent? No. Now, in fact, the next sentence states, and I quote, the mid-year team continued its investigation, taking the investigative steps and looking for evidence that could change their assessment, end of quote. This is my question. At any point in the investigation, if the team had found any evidence of intent, would the mid-year investigative team have pursued that lead? Yes? I'm sorry, I got to comment on this again. He keeps answering in the form of a question. Is this a verbal tick, or is he trying to get out of giving incomplete or false answers by saying, well, I wasn't sure? So, I didn't actually make a definitive statement. I'd love to find out the truth on that. I mean, this is a Democrat interviewing him right now, so there's no need for him to worry about giving the wrong answer, because they're just asking huge generalities that any of us could have answered without knowing a thing about the case and sound accurate. He's lying, but we can't prove that. I'm sorry, I take that back. There's a lot of stuff we've proved that he's lying about. I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that. Maybe the burger's still digesting. Okay, so pursued that lead, yes. And that includes the actual interview of Hillary Clinton. Is that correct? Yes? Cummins, all right. Now, many of your personal actions and texts have been used as evidence that the FBI, its leadership, and the Justice Department overall is deeply biased and corrupt. Fact. I'd just like to give you the opportunity to directly respond to anything you think is missing from the record or would better help the American people understand whether they should trust the career professionals at the FBI and DOJ who are protecting our country every day. Well, yeah, the career people are fine. It's the political appointees that are ultimate and complete hacks in regard to the following the truth. And they're all out now, except for Rosenstein, and he's going to be out. He's probably out today for all I know. He's going to be out really soon. Definitely just before the Mueller report drops. So he can hide out in Canada or something. Okay, so Strozk says, yes, sir, and thank you for the opportunity. I would tell you FBI agents are people, and all of us have personal political opinions, and that is something that we all feel passionately about. Not everyone is passionate about politics. They're passionate about their jobs, if they're good at them, but a lot of people are pretty indifferent about politics. So I don't know where that's coming from. But I can tell you, all of us, me, but everyone I work with, everybody I work with, these personal opinions, when you walk in the door, those get left behind. The FBI that I know and have been a member of is made up of people who pursue the facts where they lay and apply the law to those facts. I did not, nor would I ever, take any act based on my personal beliefs and in the conduct of my official business, nor would anybody else that I know working at the FBI. Right. I would not tolerate it in myself or others, and all those men and women at the FBI are exactly the same way. Fine, upstanding young man who's having an extramarital affair with a coworker. I am deeply troubled by the way that the insinuation that somehow these personal beliefs are inappropriate, or worse, are necessarily evidence of some corrupt bias, are being used to undermine the integrity of the FBI, the way that they are being used to destroy the image and trustworthiness of the FBI in the eyes of the American public for purely partisan ways. Okay, not partisan, they're trying to get to the truth. Some of these may have been blown out of proportion, like the secret society thing, but a lot of these were real smoking guns. You had more to go on with you and Page's bias against Trump. The Republicans had more to go on with those than you had to go on with the Crossfire Hurricane and Mueller investigation against Trump. By far. Lucky the IG gave you a break. Strozk continues. Yes, sweetie cat. Strozk continues. I am deeply troubled by the way that the insinuation that somehow these personal beliefs are inappropriate, or worse, are necessarily evidence of some corrupt bias, are being used to undermine the integrity of the FBI, the way that they are being used to destroy the image and trustworthiness of the FBI in the eyes of the American public for purely partisan ways. It is destructive, it is corrosive to the rule of law, and it is absolutely something terrible that's been occurring. Mr. Cummings, all right, thank you very much. Strozk, thank you, sir. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Strozk, I'm Hank Johnson. In the Clinton investigation, did you generally advocate for aggressively seeking and compelling evidence? Sir, good afternoon. Yes, I did. Did you generally advocate for or against the use of compulsory process? I typically advocated for the use of compulsory process. Yes? Why? Because in my experience, there is a point which negotiating with counsel hits a stage that is not productive or is taking too long. And my belief is that if you have the ability, through a subpoena, certainly a search warrant, to go get that evidence, it is frequently the most effective way either to get it, or usually frequently in my experience, the threat of that will cause counsel to come forward voluntarily and produce the information you want. Did Lisa Page advocate for or against the use of compulsory process in the investigation? She advocated for it? Why do you think she did that? I think you would have to ask her. My belief is that she felt, aggressive investigation is the appropriate way that the Bureau should be pursuing all its work. Were there disagreements in when to use or not use compulsory process between the FBI and the DOJ team? There were. Generally, when there were disagreements, what was the DOJ's position? Strozk, it wouldn't be right for me to generalize. You don't have to generalize. You can be very specific, dude. I think, having said that typically Bureau agents and investigators, and certainly me in this context, tend to be much more aggressive in our desire to use compulsory process and to pursue information, because our motivation tends to be just to get the information. We want to build as comprehensive a picture and understanding of what occurred, whereas DOJ attorneys are looking at it from a little bit, prosecutors, from a different perspective. They are not only, of course they want the facts, but they have concerns about how to introduce that at trial and whether or not this is something that is going to address a particular element of the crime. And that, in my career, has been a very natural tension point. So I think it's entirely consistent in this case that we tended to be more aggressive in many instances in pushing for a compulsory process than DOJ was. So here they're basically trying to hang the DOJ out to dry and take all the pressure off the FBI, which, if you do it right, could probably be pretty effective. But I think they've wasted a lot of time in their questioning when they could have been hammering away at that. I'm not a lawyer, just my opinion. Johnson, is it fair to say that in the Clinton email investigation that you adhered to a general philosophy, if you will, of FBI lawyers, that you were going to demand and be on the side of those seeking aggressive investigation using compulsory process? Strozk, yes, I think it's fair that me and the investigative team were absolutely aggressive in trying to pursue the facts and, specifically, to include compulsory process? Johnson, you treated this investigation the same way that you would any other investigation? I did? Did you ever come to believe or think that career prosecutors disagreed with your more aggressive approach based on legitimate legal differences of opinion? Yes, if I'm hearing you correctly, I did believe that the disagreements were based on legitimate disagreements based on legal reasons? Did you think that the DOJ career prosecutors were making these decisions based on their personal political views? No? Sir, Johnson still. Sir, I'd like to turn what's been marked as Exhibit 10, which is a section of the Inspector General's report, and I'd like to take you to Chapter 5, Section 3 and 4. And again, if you want to hear the entire Inspector General's report, except for the very first chapter, go to my old channel, now pretty much dead, but still, it's you can get to it. Hat's Guerrilla News, and I read the entire IG report over the course of a day and a half. It's not very well labeled, but they're in order. So have at it. I'd like to take you to Chapter 5, Section 3 and 4. Strozk, what page is that, sir? Okay, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Johnson, and I'd like to go through that section to discuss the use of compulsory process in the investigation. Did you, or have you had an opportunity to read this section of the IG report? I have. Are you familiar with the use of compulsory evidence in the mid-year exam investigation? Compulsory instruments to get that evidence, yes, I am. I will direct you to specific parts of this excerpt, but if you need any additional time to review or read in depth, please let me know. Strozk, thank you. Johnson, on the page numbered 79, the first paragraph after the subheader reads as follows. Despite the public perception that the mid-year investigation did not use a grand jury and instead relied exclusively on consent, we found that agents and prosecutors did use grand jury subpoenas and other compulsory process to gain access to documentary and digital evidence. According to documents we reviewed, at least 56 grand jury subpoenas were issued, 5 court orders were obtained pursuant to 18 U.S.C. Section 2703D, 2703D orders, and 3 search warrants were granted. Yeah, and how many of those grand jury subpoenas were, what's the word I'm looking for? Honored. Because I know there were several people who were asked to show up for interviews that did not, and were not held accountable. You can look that up. And if I'm wrong, yell at me in the comment section. I'm sure that's the case, though. Especially, you know what, wait a minute. I might be confusing the mid-year exam grand jury with the Senate investigation into the into mid-year exam. Because I know in the Senate investigation, the guy who set up the server for Clinton, I think his name was Page, I think. Anyway, he did not show up for his subpoenaed testimony in front of the Senate committee. And nothing happened to him. And I'm pretty sure that papers were put in to charge him, and Jeff Sessions said, no, it's too close to the Hillary thing, I'm not doing it. I'm about 90% positive on that. To continue with Mr. Johnson, were you part of the decision to issue any of the 56 grand jury subpoenas? Strozk. Yes, I was aware of them. I was, again, those issuance were at levels below me, but I was certainly aware of all of them. Were you part of the decision to issue any of the 5703D orders? Yes. 2703D, yes, sir. Were you part of the decision to issue any of the 3 search warrants? Yes, sir. Johnson. In fact, if you turn to page 85, end of the first line, the IG report describes an instance where you and Lisa Page appear to author a list of instances where you had clashed with the DOJ prosecutor's decisions to negotiate with counsel. And there we go again, hanging the DOJ out to dry. The report reads, quote, Strozk told us that at the time he wrote this email, he was, quote, aggravated by the limitations, unquote, that the prosecutors were placing on the FBI's ability to obtain evidence and felt that, quote, if you add up this delta over a bunch of decisions, all of a sudden it becomes substantive, end quote. Are these sections of the Inspector General's report consistent with your general experience on the mid-year review that you were aggravated by DOJ's caution? At times, yes, I was. Is the description that you were aggravated by the DOJ's hesitance to seek compulsory process accurate? I was at times aggravated by it. Yes, that's accurate. You were aggravated at times. At times, yes, sir. Generally, why did the FBI advocate for the use of compulsory process? Again, because I think in my experience that there comes a time when you can ask for something, and frequently that becomes very slow, or you end up in a series of negotiations which overly limit access to the material that you'd like to have. And in those instances, where for those items of evidence you have enough to either issue a subpoena or a search warrant, or get a 2703D order, my experience is that you just do it. It's faster, it's more aggressive, it cuts to the chase. And more than that, it also sends a tone to all the parties, to opposing counsel, to the team, to the prosecutors, that, you know, we're being aggressive. We're driving down the process of this investigation to get to a resolution. I think it's important for all those reasons. Let me just make a quick note here. Notice how infrequently Strozk says something like, you know, or, I mean, things like that. Especially, you know, Page uses it all the time. She's constantly saying, you know this, you know that. It's pretty distracting. I think especially near the end of her testimony. I don't know if she was getting tired or what, but she's got this huge verbal bookmark, you know. It can be pretty distracting. I have to give Strozk credit. He's at least well-spoken. Again, this question at the end of his answers, I don't know, but at least he can handle himself. And to finish his quote, so I think it's important for all those reasons. Mr. Johnson. And again, generally, why did the career prosecutors in this case favor obtaining evidence through consent? Sir, I think you need to ask them. I think every one of those decisions is a little bit different. I think that, again, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, they are looking at they're looking with a different lens at the material. They're looking at its relevance to the elements of the crime. They are looking at the legality and the admissibility of some of the evidence. They are looking at future back and forth with opposing counsel and developing a relationship over the span of a case. So I think every particular item probably has a different set of circumstances. But yeah, you just said that when you look at the delta, when you look at the difference of all those different decisions, that it adds up to a substantive problem. So why are you dissembling now? Mr. Johnson, did you think that the career prosecutors disagreed with the FBI based on legitimate legal differences of opinion? Generally, there's that word, generally yes. I think sometimes I was probably frustrated. I wish they were a little more gung-ho. But generally, yeah, I think it was absolutely legitimate agreement. Generally. Did you think that the DOJ career prosecutors were making these decisions based on their personal political views? No. That's funny. In your experience, did any senior political leaders at DOJ intervene in the decision to seek or not seek compulsory process? And I'll give you these names. Loretta Lynch, not to my knowledge. Sally Yates, not to my knowledge. Matt Axelrod, not to my knowledge. John Carlin, not to my knowledge. Did any of these agreements on how to obtain evidence affect the thoroughness of the investigation? No. What a crock. What an absolute crock of you-know-what. If they didn't matter, then why was he jousting consistently with the DOJ prosecutors on using compulsory requests versus, what's the word I'm looking for here? Well, to agreements, consent with the attorneys. Uncle Bobbity, AOC versus Paige Strozk verbal pause game. AOC does it because she's the brain of a dead mouse or stalling tactic. Paige Strozk do it as a stalling tactic. I'm not sure if it was a stalling tactic. I think obviously with Strozk, his stalling is his verbosity, over-verbosity in answering questions, where he goes into the whole flag-waving detail over and over again. He's obviously prepared these statements, and he follows them to the letter. I think with Paige, it's just more of a fact that she's a bit more of a scatterbrain, in my opinion. She had a couple of things that I liked. She had a sense of humor. She stuck up for herself a couple times. But for the most part, I think she's just a scatterbrain. But that's purely based on my reading of these transcripts. So it's an entirely subjective view. She was a high-level lawyer at the FBI, working as general counsel to the deputy director. So it's not like she was an idiot. But I just, at least in an interview setting, she didn't seem to handle herself very well. Okay, backing up just a little bit. Mr. Johnson, did any of the agreements on how to obtain evidence affect the thoroughness of the investigation? No. In your experience, is it common to have disagreements between FBI agents and DOJ prosecutors working on a case? Yes. Is it common for the FBI to want to move more quickly or aggressively, and for the DOJ to ask for more evidence or to take a more cautious approach? Yes, that's fair. Over and over again, they have asked this question. Especially Johnson right now. I think this is like the third pass he's had at this subject. Just say the DOJ handcuffed us. We couldn't do the job the way we're telling people we wanted to, even though when you did interview people, you constantly let them off the hook. Just say it. Just say the DOJ made up our minds from the very beginning, and we had to go through the motions. It's not like you owe them anything. Hell, they're part of the reason you lost your job. Johnson, based on your answers to this section, is it fair to say that you were aggressive in suggesting that the Clinton email investigation make use of compulsory process? Asked and answered. Strozk, yes. And is it also fair to say that you believe that the prosecutors disagreed with your suggestions based on legitimate legal differences in opinion and not because of political bias? Yes. Now, who's wasting time here? Over and over again with the same question and answer. I think the Democrats are just trying to run out the clock. just wasting the time of the committee in order to keep Strozk from having to answer more direct questions and to let him off easy. I'm not an expert on these things by any stretch, but that's the impression that I'm getting, and I'm getting it very strongly. Okay, Mr. Johnson. Okay. Sir, I want to turn your attention to the reopening of the Clinton email investigation after the discovery of emails on Anthony Weiner's laptop. Were you a part of the process of reopening or the decision to reopen the investigation? Hey, Ray. Nice to see you, sir. Nice to see you. To quote Strozk, his greatest line in his head, at least, "I'm better than you, so stop asking me stupid questions." Yeah, that was the attitude during the open hearing. Certainly, he's jousted with Gowdy quite a bit, but I think Gowdy didn't let him get away with anything like he pulled during the open session. He's not grandstanding as much. He's still making self-serving speeches, but he's not going off the rails like he did. And if you look at the middle picture here on the left, that's him during the, and the top one too, that's him during the open session. So as you can see, there's a lot of acting going on there. And in what I'm reading here, he's just covering his butt. To repeat, Mr. Johnson, the last sentence, were you a part of the process of reopening or the decision to reopen the investigation? Yes. Did you help draft the December 2016 letter that Director Comey sent to Congress announcing the reopening of the email investigation? I believe it was October 2016. Yes. You participated in the drafting of that letter? I did. Was it your understanding that that letter would be to Congress and would not be made public? My understanding was it was likely to immediately be made public. Well, let me ask you this question. Did you still support sending the letter even if it would become public? I ultimately supported the decision to send the letter by Director Comey to send the letter to Congress. Why did you support sending that letter to Congress? Johnson was not expecting these answers. He's really caught off guard here. He's totally in the weeds. Congressman, it was an extraordinarily difficult decision, and I was one of a number of people who was in that debate in advising Director Comey. I think he has spoken at length and eloquently about his thought process before this body, as well as in his book and in public. In other words, patting himself on the back the entire time. It was a decision that none of us took lightly, and a decision that, I think, for all of us, was right on the margin. I think for everybody, it was a 51-49 sort of thought. I think at the end of the day, given the fact that Director Comey had made the speech that he did on July 5th, and the inference that if there was a change that he, in subsequent statements to Congress, that he had made, that for a variety of reasons, but certainly one of those reasons, that were we to reopen active investigation, that he and the FBI had an obligation to notify Congress. Okay, that's about 5 sentences where he only needed 10 words. So I don't want to speak to all of the reasons. That's not a question for him, and I think he's answered that. That's not a question for him? But that's my understanding of one of the many reasons why it was done. Did you agree with the decision to reopen the email investigation after the discovery of the emails on Anthony Weiner's laptop? Yes, I did. And you supported the sending of the letter that you helped draft to Congress? With not nearly the same surety that I had that we needed to reactivate the investigation, but yes, I did support it. Bacon's making my mouth dry. I should have known that. You knew that it would be made public. I'm sorry, public? Yes, I did. Well, I suspected it to a level of belief that it was almost certain. And you knew that it would hurt the Hillary Clinton campaign, did you not, if it became public? I did. Yes, I did. But still, you acquiesced in sending the letter? I don't think acquiesce is the right word. I think after the debate, I agreed with the decision. Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. All right, Ms. Kim. We'll go off the record for a second. Thank you. The time is 5:32. Discussion off the record. Kim, we're going back to on the record. Time is 5:33. Mr. Cicilline, I'm pretty sure I'm getting that right. And it's going to be C from now on. Mr. Strozk, I'm David C. from Rhode Island. Sir, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I just want to begin with one brief question where Mr. Johnson left off. I think you said you agreed with the decision and maybe even participated in the discussion about the appropriateness of notifying Congress about the reopening of the Clinton investigation. Yes, sir. And you knew at the time that that was likely to be made public and likely to do harm to her candidacy. Yes. And did you contribute to that decision as a result of bias that you had toward Hillary Clinton? No. What contributed to your rendering that decision along with your colleagues? It was solely driven by the objective pursuit of the investigation and the right thing to do with regard to Bureau policies and past actions. Okay, I may have to retract my earlier characterization of Johnson's questioning as him being in the weeds. I can see now how they're laying the foundation to show that Strozk was not so in the bag for Hillary that he would object strongly to publishing that letter to Congress that Comey wrote, reactivating the investigation. I can see where they're going with it now. I spoke too soon. I'm fairly certain I was wrong about that. I'll back up a little bit. Mr. C., what contributed to your rendering that decision along with your colleagues? It was solely driven by the objective pursuit of the investigation and the right thing to do with regard to Bureau policies and past actions. So when we heard our colleagues spend a lot of time today suggesting you had a bias against President Trump or candidate Trump, how would that square with your decision to divulge something that you knew would be harmful to her election and may, in fact, have significantly contributed to her loss? Okay, yeah, I was wrong about it earlier. I see. He just laid it out perfectly. Strozk. Sir, I think that's the absolute deep underlying fallacy and irony of this entire line. Yeah, the fact that Hillary was consistently and blatantly breaking the law, yet you had nothing on Trump but supposition and baseless accusations. I can see how you were completely fair in this regard. Strozk. The things that I did, immediately sending agents to contact New York, not getting the subpoena and bringing the laptop to Washington for review, or an image of the laptop, merely sending people to stand there and look at it. I'm sorry. That whole Wiener thing really ticks me off. The things that I did, immediately sending agents to contact New York, advocating that we need to open the case as soon as I found out that there was potentially relevant information, drafting the letter to Congress, while at the same time saying nothing, keeping extraordinarily compartmented the work we were doing with regard to Russian influence investigations. All of those actions universally, and none of them were driven by these considerations, but all of those actions were to the detriment of the candidacy of Secretary Clinton and to the benefit of candidate Trump. So it's extraordinarily, quote-unquote, ironic, is probably a very kind word, that that's the perception being attempted to be portrayed. Thank you. Mr. C. still. And I want to turn your attention to the July 5th, 2016 statement that Director Comey drafted on the Clinton investigation recommending not to prosecute Secretary Clinton. And I'd like to walk you through what happened in a little more detail. Can you describe the general process that Director Comey used in drafting the July 5th statement on the Clinton investigation, and particularly, what was your role in drafting or editing the statement? So, I don't know how he drafted it. When I was forwarded, my recollection is that I was forwarded an email by Deputy Director McCabe of something Director Comey had written a draft. I don't know the process or how he did it, but in any event, it was forwarded to me. A small number of folks on the team and kind of asked for, thoughts. What do you think about this? And then, following that point in time, there were innumerable discussions among the investigative team about that statement and things ranging, again, I mentioned earlier, factual accuracies, things that we could state, the most appropriate and accurate way to state things, interpretations of law, past practice of law, characterizations of law, and putting that all together in a way that would be understandably by somebody who, that would be understandable by somebody who wasn't a lawyer. And the first time you saw that was receiving a draft that you understood was prepared by Director Comey himself, correct? That's my understanding. And that would have been in an email that you received from Mr. McCabe on May 6th of 2016. I don't know that. If you do, I'll take your representation. Okay. Who held the authority to approve the final language of the July 5th, 2016 statement? Director Comey. So you didn't have the authority to approve the final language or the statement recommending not to prosecute Secretary Clinton. Is that right? That's right. And did you ever make edits or suggestions, modifications to that statement with the purpose of helping Secretary Clinton or damaging the Trump campaign? No. I'm sorry. I can't, I can't read that with a straight face. Bald-faced lie. Jeez. Mr. C, did anyone else, to your knowledge, not to my knowledge, no, did you ever push back on the group consensus on the legal conclusions that were made during the drafting process? Some of them you have discussed already in this testimony. Push back, I don't know that I would use that word. There was a lot of robust discussion about the various legal aspects, but all the conclusions, I think, were supported by the facts and law and precedent. And were the members of the mid-year exam FBI team free to express their concerns throughout the drafting process? Yes. And do you recall any member of the team expressing significant disagreements about the statement's final wording? I do not. Of course not. They were all in the bag to exonerate her. Why would there be any pushback? Did anyone significantly disagree with the final language in Director Comey's July 5th, 2016 press statement, which was written weeks before he gave it? Strozk, no. Now, there has been a lot of excitement by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the initial statement being drafted before the FBI officially closed the Clinton investigation in July 2016, and some have even suggested something suspicious about that. How could that be? Would you explain, do you believe that Director Comey acted improperly or prematurely by drafting an initial statement before Secretary Clinton and other interviews occurred? Can you explain why or why not? And is that an unusual practice in the normal course of an investigation? So, I don't think it is unusual to think about the violations or exposure of any particular individual may or may not have. This was unusual in that statement was made with regard to an individual that we were not going to recommend charges. But setting that aside, how can you set that aside? That's the entire basis. But setting that aside, I don't think the fact that prior to the conclusion of a case, particularly one that's particularly intensive and has had a lot of work done, that prosecutors and agents arrived at an understanding before the case is complete that there were significant flaws in some or all potential charges or absolutely strong, sustainable charges. Very nice, Ray. If Anthony Weir's laptop, wouldn't that be so good for Trump? It would be. I'm sorry I don't recognize the tune. I'd sing it if I could, but yes, absolutely. Wouldn't it be so good for Trump? It would be. Very good. Strozk continues. So it is not, my observation is that in a big case, it can frequently occur that people have an idea well before the end of the case whether or not you're going to be able to overcome hurdles to prosecution. C. Thank you. I'm now going to ask you to turn your attention to an exhibit that Turn your attention to an exhibit that I'd ask be marked as Exhibit 11 and ask, do you recognize this email? Strozk, I do. And it was written by you alone, or was it a reflection of a collaborative discussion? It was a collaborative discussion. And the email has a redacted name. Do you remember who besides you and John Moffa collaborated on this email? I don't. It's one of two people, Ms. Page or another OGC attorney. And if you turn to the second page under the subheader, Topic for Further Discussions, you wrote 6. Whether her conduct rises to the legal definition of gross negligence, end quote. Do you see that? I do. Why did the team need to have further discussion about whether Secretary Clinton's conduct rose to the legal definition of gross negligence? Because this, my recollection, sir, is this came up in the context of going through the draft statement. Some of the attorneys, if I recall correctly, it was not me, but I think it was one of the attorneys, raised the question, okay, well, he's saying here gross negligence. Is that what he means? That is, I'm not an attorney, but that carries a legal definition with it. Clearly, it's part of the statutes, but it also goes to, an application across a variety of statutes. And so, as I recall, the issue being raised by the attorneys, it was, hey, we need to talk about this because I'm not sure that it is exactly right here. And that presence there on that list, this topic number 6, is simply flagging that for further discussion. C. And in that discussion, do you recall whether or not a member of the team was concerned specifically about using language that is also a legal standard and that might result in some confusion? If it's true, how is it confusing? Ah, Oscar Mayer's song. Gotcha. If we had Anthony Weiner's laptop, wouldn't that be so good for Trump? It would be. Very nice. Very nice. I hope I didn't butcher that too much. Now Oscar Mayer's going to come after me. Mr. C. And were you the first to raise this concern, or was it a view of others in the group? I didn't raise it. It was the view of others in the group. And my recollection is, certainly, on the team with the DOJ attorneys, this issue of demonstrating intent and the scienter elements was something we had discussed in the past. I don't know if, in the context of the director, this point had been raised or not. It may have been, but I just don't remember. Do you recall whether you had a view on this question? My view was that it was complicated, and I didn't understand the issue in the way the really bright attorneys did. So, Strozk is saying he's never come across a case before where he fully understood the use of the term gross negligence in the charging document. I find that very hard to believe. C. Did the team ultimately reach a consensus on whether Secretary Clinton had acted in a grossly negligent manner? Strozk. I think the closest I would say, and I would defer to the attorneys, I think as I recall it, there was some concern as to whether or not we could demonstrate that because of how that was defined in various ways in various courts. But again, that is my non-attorney, non-legal understanding of the issue. It's a full cop-out is what it is. C. Now I'm going to ask you, Mr. Strozk, to look at a document that has been marked as Exhibit 12. This is an exhibit of a resolution introduced by Republican members of Congress on May 22, 2018, requesting that the Attorney General appoint a second special counsel to investigate the Department of Justice and the FBI. And I believe that request has been raised again not too long ago. I think within the last 2 weeks, actually. On page 4, the first clause begins, and I quote, whereas Director Comey, in the final draft of his statement, allowed FBI agent Peter Strozk to replace grossly negligent, which is legally punishable under federal law, with extremely careless, which is not legally punishable under federal law. Do you see that paragraph? I do. And Mr. Strozk, do you agree with the characterization that Director Comey, and I quote, allowed you to replace grossly negligent with extremely careless? Yes, Ray, you're right. No, you knows. And you brought that up so well Saturday in regards to the Page testimony. Yeah, I was. In fact, I didn't get. I don't remember if it was Friday or Saturday, but you had put a last comment on the board in the chat about coming back the next day. And I just read the salient parts of it because I was not paying attention very very closely, and so I missed the joke, and I apologize for that. It was very well put. I just wanted to let you know I ultimately did notice that. I'll repeat, Mr. C. And Mr. Strozk, do you agree with the characterization that Director Comey, and I quote, allowed you to replace grossly negligent with extremely careless? No. At the time grossly negligent was used in the initial draft, did Director Comey's statement conclude that the FBI recommended prosecution of Secretary Clinton? It did not recommend that. Did the edit of replacing grossly negligent with extremely careless change the FBI's substantive conclusion in any way? No. No, the conclusion had already been made. It didn't change the conclusion. It just changed the ability of the statement to charge Hillary. You just took it off the table is all. It didn't change any, and there's no way it was going to change the conclusion. That had already been made. Yes, Ray, constitutionally vague. The founders are spinning in their graves. Absolutely. And I'll ask the question again, which I believe I've asked several times before. If it was constitutionally vague, why did they leave it on the books? One of the Republican questioners earlier brought that up, that it was legally sound, that there was no vagueness in the statute. And so I'll ask again, if the DOJ didn't like that statute, why did they leave it sitting there? It's like those old blue laws where, you couldn't walk an ostrich down the street on a Sunday in Oklahoma City. I'm making that up, but there were laws similar to that. I believe horses couldn't wear hats was one, things like that. Why wasn't the DOJ being more aggressive about getting this cleared up? I don't remember them asking a court for any kind of a ruling on the vagueness of that law, of that statute, when they were investigating Clinton. They just said, you know what, I don't think it works. We're walking away from it. Do what you got to do, FBI, but we're not going to charge her. That makes no sense, unless you're in the bag for Hillary and you don't want anything to happen to her, in which case you leave it exactly as it is and characterize it the way you want to. C. Did the edit of replacing grossly negligent with extremely careless change the FBI's substantive conclusion in any way? No. Do you recall specifically whether that edit was made by you or someone else? It was not made by me. A bunch of us were sitting in my office. It is possible I was typing that in, but that change was not submitted by me. How convenient. And was that change a reflection of the opinion of the group? It was certainly the opinion of the attorneys, who I think explained to the group in a way that we said, yes, we agree, or that makes sense to the extent we understand it. It's not the way Baker saw it. So you're letting the DOJ attorneys lead you by the nose, basically, which is what we've proven time and time again. C. And why ultimately was the edit made? I think because 1, the director decided he wanted it made. 2, well, there's great reasoning. 2, I think it was the consensus that it was, from a legal and common reading perspective, the most appropriate or a better way to say what Director Comey was trying to convey. So the assertion that's made in this official document by Republican members of Congress about you is false as it relates to you changing the word. That's correct. Now I'm going to ask you, Mr. Strozk, if you would turn to page 3, where the 4th clause states, and I quote, whereas according to transcripts obtained by the Senate Judiciary Committee, former Director Comey was prepared to exonerate Hillary Clinton as early as April or May of 2016 when he began to draft a statement announcing the end of his investigation before up to 17 key witnesses, including former Secretary Clinton and several of her closest aides, were interviewed. Now this is the IG report. Mr. Strozk, is it accurate to say former Director Comey was prepared to exonerate Hillary Clinton as early as April or May of 2016? I don't believe that's accurate. C. If the FBI's interviews of Secretary Clinton and others produced new evidence that supported prosecuting Secretary Clinton, would the FBI have ignored that evidence and stuck with the existing draft statement? No. In other words, did the initial draft statements in the spring of 2016 lock in the FBI's recommendations not to prosecute regardless of any new evidence? No. Well, let me ask you this, Strozk. If that's the case, why was there not a second memo written that would explain how she was going to be charged, leading to a kind of a guess, but still I would say a fairly substantial guess that you were going to uncover evidence, and you would need that second memo as a way to back up whether you were going to charge her. So you'd have one to read if you charged her, and you'd have one to read if you didn't. So they'd be ready the day that Comey wanted to come out and exonerate her or not exonerate her. Why weren't there 2? Why weren't you covering your butt? Because the DOJ told you weren't going to be able to prosecute. That's why. So it was made up. It was made. Your minds were made up well beforehand. And if you want to say they were made up for you by the DOJ, then fine. But you did not have an autonomous investigation. That's been proven time and time again in today's testimony. C. In other words, did the initial draft statements in the spring of 2016 lock in the FBI's recommendations not to prosecute regardless of any new evidence? No. But the FBI did not actually receive new evidence in these interviews that supported prosecuting Secretary Clinton. Isn't that correct? That's correct. It's because they allowed them to lie all the time. C. And now I would ask you to turn, Strozk, Congressman, I would expand on that a little bit. The information that we developed subsequent to the drafting of that statement did not get us to the point where I think Director Comey could reasonably conclude that charges were appropriate. And that's not Comey's job. That's the DOJ's job. But the DOJ wanted Comey to come out and say that he didn't recommend prosecution, to therefore take the load off of the DOJ's back, when in fact they were the ones pushing for no charges the entire time. C. And I just want to say that the IG report at page 238, and I quote, found, We found no evidence that Comey's public statement announcing the FBI's decision to close the investigation was the result of bias or an effort to influence the election. I don't think anyone's ever said that. Instead, the documentary and testament... Oh, I'm sorry, I'll take that back. I wasn't thinking clearly. I retract that entire statement. Excuse me. Continuing with C. Instead, the documentary and testamentary evidence reviewed by the OIG reflected that Comey's decision was a result of his consideration of the evidence that the FBI had collected during the course of the investigation and his understanding of the proof required to pursue a prosecution under the relevant statutes. End quote. Mr. Strozk, is that the conclusion consistent with your experience? Yes. Okay, remember, the IG cannot say you should have or you should not have prosecuted. They can't make legal conclusions. They can only draw from the record and state facts. The decision to prosecute or not prosecute was not Comey's to make, but the IG can't say that. So that was really not adequately addressed. But the IG's hands were tied. They say so in the report. So Comey got away with murder. C. So bias or an effort to influence the election was not part of the FBI's decision-making in any way. Correct. Maybe not the FBI's decision-making, but certainly the DOJ's. Do you have any reason to believe that Director Comey's recommendations against prosecuting Hillary Clinton was influenced by any improper conversations, including political bias? No. Was your opinion influenced by political bias? No. Or was your opinion based on facts and evidence, as you've already stated? Yes. Since he's already stated it, why are you asking again? C. So I want to just turn, just for a moment now, Mr. Strozk, to this whole notion of political bias. I know the suggestion has been made that the vast majority of the FBI, and the agents that serve the FBI are Democrats, and they are biased in favor of Democrats. Do you think that's a true statement? I don't believe anyone has ever said that the vast majority of the FBI were Democrats. It was the leadership of the FBI were Democrats and were in the bag for Hillary. Or at least totally against Trump, at the very least. You can certainly say that. I mean, Loretta Lynch meeting with Bill Clinton on the tarmac in Phoenix, supposedly talking about golf, Brexit, and grandkids for 45 minutes in an unrecorded interview, or at least discussion, on her private jet, and then coming out and recusing herself, quasi-recusing herself 2 days later. No political bias. So the question is that the majority of the FBI and the agents that serve the FBI are Democrats, and they are biased in favor of Democrats. Do you think that's a true statement? Strozk, no. Are FBI agents and professionals such as yourself allowed to have personal political affiliations and opinions? Yes. Asked and answered several times. C. When the FBI staffs a political sensitive investigation, for example, a public corruption case, does the FBI request the personal political persuasion of its agents in making those staffing decisions? No. Again asked and answered. They're wasting time. C. Why not? Strozk, because I don't know that it would be legal. That is not a consideration that's taken into account, in my experience, in staffing investigations. So then, explain why there are no Republican lawyers on the Mueller investigation. Mueller is technically a Republican, but if you think for an instance that he's not at least mostly in the Never Trump bag, I would love to have that discussion with you. C. And is it also not the expectation that an FBI professional, whether they have political persuasion or opinion, will understand their obligation to separate that from their duties at the FBI? They will understand that, yes. In fact, when the FBI puts together a team of investigators, is the consideration ever, I need a couple of Republicans or a couple of Democrats? Never. Does the FBI ask about the political affiliations of its own agents? Not to my knowledge. Do they ever bring up the fact that you're having an affair with a coworker? Oh, I can't answer that. C. And in fact, is it explicitly forbidden for the FBI to ask about political affiliations for staffing investigations? That's my understanding, yes. And how do FBI agents know not to let political bias interfere with their political work? They have a checklist that they follow, you idiot. Strozk, because it is ingrained in everything we do. It is part of our training, it is part of the law, it is part of the code and culture of who we are. And in your experience, in your time at the FBI and with the Justice Department, have you seen evidence of anybody applying political bias in their investigation of any subject matter? Not to my knowledge, no. We've gone over this time and time again. I don't have to repeat myself on that. Is there any reason to believe that Jim Comey's political affiliation affected the way he investigated Secretary Clinton's email server? No. Now the final area. Do I have time? Ms. Kim, yes. C. You indicated in response to some earlier questioning that you, in responding to describing some of your tweets, that you were contemplating some possibilities about the potential involvement of the Trump campaign or officials within the Trump campaign to have actively coordinated with the Russian adversaries during the course of the presidential election. Strozk, yes. C. And I take it that any good investigator, as you're learning facts and conducting interviews and gathering evidence, part of your responsibility is to sort of contemplate possibilities. Sure, you can contemplate possibilities, but I don't think you should contemplate impeachment when you have absolutely zero evidence of the candidate doing anything, and not even having any evidence that people associated with the campaign have done anything. You've just got innuendo, a false basis of facts based on the Steele dossier later on. There was nothing there, but you had everything with the Clinton investigation, so don't give me that. Strozk, yes. C. It helps you decide where to go and what additional evidence to look for. Yes. So you came at some moment in this investigation where I think you described it as the gravest possibility, you began to contemplate what you call the gravest possibility. Yes. And what was the gravest possibility as you saw it? The gravest possibility I saw, based on the allegation, here we are, allegation, that Russia was colluding with members of the Trump campaign, the gravest possibility was that candidate Trump himself was engaged in collusion with the government of Russia to gain the presidency. And there's absolutely no basis, in fact, for that possibility. And you know it, Strozk. C. And I take it as a national security professional that if you saw evidence that proved that to be true, you would consider that to be worthy of removal from office. If that were true, I would, yes. And they never saw any of it, because if they had, they would have pulled Trump out immediately. And instead, he's been wallowing as a subject. Well, not the subject, actually. He's been wallowing in the shadow of an investigation of his campaign for 2 years, when Hillary got 8 months and was let off. C. And without telling us the nature of the evidence in this setting, did there come a time during the course of this investigation that the reality of that grave description we just gave, did you see evidence to support that claim? You know he can't answer that. Bessie, I'm sorry, Congressman, if I may interrupt. C, do I have a choice? Bessie, she hasn't interviewed you once during this entire time. I hope that was meant as a joke. Bessie, for Mr. Strozk to answer that, it goes into sort of what he looked at during the investigation that's now under the purview of the special counsel. So I will instruct him not to answer that question. C, okay, even if I certainly respect that, and I'm not asking you in any way to comment on what you saw or the quality. That's exactly what you just did. I'm asking you to describe your state of mind after having done that. Bessie, his state of mind is going to be based on evidence that he was privy to and information that he knew. C, okay, I'll try something else. C, as you spent time during the course of this investigation doing your work of interviewing witnesses, looking at the evidence, did that grave example that you used as you would consider the gravest, most dangerous thing, did you develop more or less concern that that was a possibility? Jesus Christ, you idiot, he can't answer that. When the Republicans tried asking that over and over again, he batted them away. And you think you can get away with it? Were you paying attention at all? Bessie, Congressman, I think that would also... C, I'm going to ask a much more skilled staffer to help me. Goldman, I don't know that it's a matter of skill. It's the question. Kim, Mr. Strozk, I'd like to touch quickly on a letter coming out of the Senate today. So Senator Lindsey Graham sent a letter to the Deputy Attorney General. I'm asking the questions that are being posed to the DOJ today. Strozk, So he asked, did you, Mr. Strozk, have any role in retaining or supervising the confidential informant who Lindsey Graham characterizes as targeting the Trump campaign and Trump associates at the beginning of the Russia probe? A, I can answer that, but my concern goes to a point that was made earlier, that by answering that, redacted, period. and I don't know that's a path we can go down. Bessie, I'm sorry, is that a letter that was drafted to go out or went out today? Kim, it has gone out today, yes. Bessie, so the FBI would have to look at that and make a decision as to how and if it can respond to that. So I don't think that Mr. Strozk can respond to that. Kim, I understand. Let me try to phrase it in a more general way. Mr. Strozk, have you had any role in instructing a confidential informant to infiltrate or investigate a major presidential campaign? That goes to the heart of the investigation, which is now the Mueller investigation, which he can't talk about. I don't know where these idiots think they can get away asking these questions that they made fun of the Republicans for trying to ask. This is unbelievable. Bessie, again, if it's based on his involvement in a specific investigation, he will not be able to understand that question. Kim, I understand the FBI's equities. The concern that I have is that by not being able to clarify that he has never participated in the infiltration of the campaign, his good name is unnecessarily being dragged through the mud. I think it's too late for that, Kim. I think he's pretty well dirtied up as much as he's going to be. C. Can I just say one thing? If, for the sake of argument, the answer to that were no, then it's clearly not revealing anything about an investigation because it's a fact that didn't happen. He can't not answer it. If he doesn't answer it, it's the same as an answer. So I think if the answer is no, you can answer no without having to comment on an ongoing investigation. Kim, and one more thing I'll raise is I am rephrasing almost exactly a question I asked earlier to which Mr. Strozk was allowed to respond. Goldman, was allowed to respond? Kim, he was indeed. Goldman, can we just have one moment? Kim, yes. Discussion off the record. Kim, I think we'll go back on the record. It's 6 p.m. by Ms. Kim. Mr. Strozk, have you ever been a part of the FBI's efforts to infiltrate a U.S. political campaign? No. Have you ever been a part of an effort to put a spy in a U.S. political campaign? No. And again, we're going to argue about the word spy in the media. Q. I think if that's the best we can do, you've given those answers, and I have no reason to doubt that you are. C. Can I add one thing? To your knowledge, at that time that you were at the Bureau, have you ever heard of that happening? Strozk. No, I do not have personal knowledge of that happening. I'm sorry, of that happening? Again, personal knowledge I'm not aware of. I'm sorry, Senator, I do not recall. That's Hillary, of course, he's talking to Congressman. That was during the Benghazi investigation. I'm sorry, Senator, I do not recall. She said that over and over again. Kim, did you have any role in reviewing, approving, or supplying information for the FISA warrant obtained to surveil Carter Page? Strozk, I think we've asked and been able to answer that in the past. Bessie, yes. I think how it was phrased earlier was about whether you signed, Kim, an affidavit? Bessie, right. So may we confer? Kim, sure, certainly. Discussion off the record. Kim, we will go back on the record. It's 6:01. Goldman, the witness has been instructed by counsel for the agency not to answer that question and will abide by that direction. Kim, thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin, thank you very much. Mr. Strozk, the criticism of you seems to come down to the suggestion that the few texts that were identified somehow reflected a general conspiracy that was going to fix the presidential contest. Was there any political conspiracy at the FBI to alter the outcome of the election? Not that I'm aware of. Okay, and do your texts reflect a conspiracy or an agreement between you and your close friend to alter the outcome of the election? No. Okay. Is all of this much ado about nothing? I believe so, yes. Well, that's not a self-serving question and statement at all. Raskin, do you view it as a massive distraction and red herring? I don't know that I'm ready to go through what I think it is. I do believe, yes, it is absolutely a distraction and is not accurate in any way. Raskin, okay. When we first got some portion of the texts that were disclosed to us by the Department of Justice, I noticed that there were these offhand political slams, I suppose I would call them, directed not just at President Trump, but at Eric Holder, I think Hillary Clinton. I think my friend Martin O'Malley came in for some hits. Bernie Sanders, I think, was described at one point as an idiot, which is a word that was also used for President Trump. Even at the informal level of personal banter, which your task about the president appeared to me, would you agree that you were making the same kinds of offhand casual comments about other political figures that people do in friendships all the time? Strozk, yes. Raskin, and even within the paranoid view of these texts as relating to, some kind of ongoing belief system, if we accepted that. Paranoid view of ongoing belief system? How can you say it's a paranoid view? He obviously had a particular belief system. It's there in black and white. I don't care if they're offhand comments or not. I can smell the Trump supporters. Come on. I'll go back. Mr. Raskin. And even within the paranoid view of these texts as relating to, some kind of ongoing belief system, if we accepted that, we would have to accept that basically the dialogue reflects a general irreverence or a general skepticism about politicians. Isn't that right? That's fair. Oh yeah, he was generally skeptical about Trump. That's a perfect characterization of his texts. General skepticism. Very good. Very good. Raskin, okay. And as I read the dialogue, it could have appeared in the texting history of probably tens of millions of Americans. Yeah, but those Americans weren't running investigations against the two front-running political candidates in the general election, were they? I mean, even the most damning nuggets that your critics have seized upon, things like, he's an idiot, could probably be found in tens of millions of texts. I mean, I suppose you're no expert on that, but would you agree that the things that were said in the course of general political vernacular that people speak to with their friends? I do agree. Okay. Raskin, okay, that's all I've got. Thanks. Kim, we'll be going off the record now. It's 6:06, recess. They come back at 6:12. Okay, Chairman Goodlatte, we'll go back on the record at 6:12 p.m. Agent Strozk, you were asked earlier if you made the decision on how to classify the mid-year exam investigation, and you said that you did not. Is that correct? Mr. Chairman, that's correct. Who did make the decision? I don't know. That was done before I joined the case, and it probably would have been somebody at headquarters, but I don't know who did that. Who was in charge of the case at headquarters? My understanding was that it was run out of the Counterintelligence Division initially. Section Chief Sandy Cable had that effort, and he had folks in his section working on it. At the time, he reported to Randy Coleman, who was Bill Priestap's predecessor, and then the deputy at the time was Mark Giuliano. The EID, I don't know who that was at the time. Who ordinarily would make that classification? Ordinarily, because it was at headquarters, that is hard to answer. In the field, ordinarily that would be the case agent and the supervisory special agent on the squad that was opening the case. At headquarters, that would typically, I don't think there's atypically when it's at headquarters. Chairman Goodlatte. Now, on the Trump-Russia investigation, who was a subordinate supervisor to you that you referenced earlier? There were a couple of them. There was a supervisory special agent. There was a supervisory intelligence analyst. John Moffa and I, as we did in mid-year, kind of had parallel roles, but we were, for the Russia influence investigations, kind of at a higher level. But there was both the supervisory special agent and the supervisory intelligence analyst. Goodlatte. Now, I want to talk to you about your communications with Lisa Page. Earlier, you were asked whether you didn't think that some of the expressions you made involving various obscene comments about Donald Trump were hateful. I think you said that you wouldn't call them that. You would call them a reflection of personal belief in a private conversation. Strozk. Yes, sir. Goodlatte. So you do not believe that you can make a statement of personal belief in a private conversation that is of a hateful nature? Well, I do believe you can make a statement in a private conversation that is of a hateful nature. So would you characterize the statements that you made about Donald Trump in the private conversations as being hateful? I would not. Why would you not? Because when you ask me what it means for me to hate somebody, I do not hate President Trump. That's, in my mind, that is reserved for something entirely different from that. So a guy that you think could possibly be colluding with the Russians to throw the presidential campaign in his favor, the Russians who you have a deep and abiding animosity for, you couldn't work up a level of hate for him? Oh, okay. Yeah, I get it. Strozk continues. I would characterize these again, as I did before, private expressions of personally held belief. Certainly emotive, certainly charged, but not hateful. Goodlatte. Now, you were asked about a text in which you referenced being in a place where there were Trump supporters, and how did you characterize them? Sir, what I think I characterized them as earlier is that I was struck by the difference in the way political support existed in a constituency in Southern Virginia, so radically different from the same state just 100 miles away, that was of a vastly different character. You said you could smell. Oh, yes, sir, I did say that. And what does that mean? Sir, and again, this has been gone over. I don't know why Goodlatte's bothering with this. Sir, and again, I appreciate Congressman Gowdy trying to dissect what that meant. For me, that was a quick analogy. I'm typing a text. It was just as likely if I could have used see or hear. It was not anything other than just that it's strikingly apparent to me the level of Trump support here and how different that is from Northern Virginia. Goodlatte. Now, you talked about risking the source versus pursuing the investigation as an explanation for your text involving a reference to an insurance policy. Can you explain to me why you would be saying to Miss Page in the first place? Yes, sir, because my recollection from the text was part of a discussion that we had had in the context of having received information from an extremely sensitive source, and that one of the debates on how to pursue this information was how much risk to put that sensitive source in because, in my experience, the more aggressive investigation, the greater chance of burning or compromising that source. Excuse me. Strozk continues. And the reason I believe I mentioned it to Ms. Page, and certainly from the context of the text and saying she threw it out, there was a kind of thought process or a proposal by some that, look, the polls, the pundits, everybody, Republicans, Democrats, think it's very unlikely that candidate Trump would win the presidency. And because of that, some people were arguing these allegations of collusion, whatever they may or may not be in terms of accurate, it doesn't really matter as much because he's not going to get elected. So we can take as many counterintelligence investigations to 3-4 years because we have that time. And again, it took 8 months to exonerate Hillary, and it's going to take you 3 or 4 years to figure out if anybody in the Trump campaign colluded with Russia, or if Trump colluded with Russia, illegally colluded with Russia, since collusion isn't illegal, that they were compromised wittingly or working with them wittingly or unwittingly. 3 years, and you can wait because he may not get elected. Does that make sense at all to anybody? I mean, he has made this statement, I think, 4 times now, and it still doesn't wash in my view. I know I'm biased. I wear that on my sleeve, but still, I just don't see how you can pull this off. Strozk continues. My argument back to those people advocating that was, look, we can't assume anybody, one or the other, is going to get elected, even if it's unlikely, if it's unlikely that you're going to die before you're 40, even if it's unlikely that President, then candidate Trump, would be elected president. We need to do our job because the mission of the FBI, what the American people, what Congress, what candidate Trump expect, is that we would go out and aggressively look at those allegations because if he were elected, some of those people might be wrapped up in those allegations, might be placed in positions of significant authority and responsibility in the national security staffing of the White House. How the guy who initiated the investigation couldn't get his way in this regard, if he was in fact advocating for it, I don't believe. So you call that an insurance policy? Strozk. Sir, that's an analogy that I use to try and say when there is something unlikely that probably isn't going to happen, nevertheless Goodlatte, can you understand why somebody reading that would believe that the insurance policy was a way to stop Donald Trump from becoming president or preventing him from continuing on as president based upon improperly using the aggressive investigation that you refer to here? Mr. Chairman, I would tell you, 1, it wasn't. And 2, I think the most common sense reading of that, particularly given my explanation, it is the most persuasive, simplest understanding of that because it's true and that it was not. I'm not even going to try to read that again. I know many people have said, there's this inference and many people can have many interpretations of it, but I wrote it and I'm telling you what I meant. Goodlatte. Did you ever have any conversations with Director Comey regarding these texts? No. At any time? No. Never. Did you ever have any conversations with Lisa Page that are printed other than the ones that have been made available to us? I don't understand your question, sir. The question is, are there existing texts other than the ones that you and I both have been provided for in preparation for this? Strozk. I believe there are texts that the Inspector General is in the process of recovering, but I don't have those and haven't seen them. But there is my understanding, the FBI data systems had some sort of faulty software that did not preserve all the texts and that the IG is recovering some of those. Goldman, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Can I have 1 minute? Discussion off the record. Strozk, right. So, sir, would you re-ask the question? Goodlatte, yes. So the question is, are there other communications, written communications with Lisa Page, other than the ones we are asking you about, based upon documents produced to us and to you in preparation for today? Yes. My understanding is that the Inspector General recovered texts that are purely of a personal nature that were not produced to me, to FBI, and I don't believe they've been produced to the Hill. Goodlatte. And who made the determination that they were of a personal nature? Strozk, I don't know. You don't know. And was the Inspector General involved in his office, or was it somebody at the FBI or somebody in the Department of Justice? No. My belief is that the entirety of the texts were produced to the Inspector General, and the Inspector General did the separation, but you'd have to ask him. I also know that there has been in the production kind of review to say, okay, there's a if there are things that are personal to redact it. But my understanding, but you'd have to ask the IG, is that the IG and his staff did that separation. Goodlatte. Have you ever had conversations of the nature regarding, I call them reflecting animus, if not hatefulness, with regard to these communications with Miss Page with any other person? I have had conversations with some close friends about my personal beliefs. Are these communications written? No. The ones? Goodlatte. No texts with anybody other than Lisa Page? Strozk. I have had communications, including texts with friends, about personal topics, including my personal political beliefs. Now to, sir, your question as to the nature of this content. No. Goodlatte. Reflecting what I would call, you've decided to characterize it simply as a personal opinion, but personal opinions can be characterized by yourself and by others as reflecting an attitude, including a hateful attitude or an attitude of animus towards somebody. Have you done that? Not of the same nature, volume, no. All right. Have you had conversations with other officials at the FBI regarding these texts? Yes. With whom? Then Deputy Director McCabe, Associate Director Bowditch. Associate Deputy Director Bowditch. Goodlatte. Were these conversations before these texts became known to the public or after? These were before the texts became known to the public. Who else? Sir, I'd have to think about it. The reason I'm pausing is there may be in the context of friends, whether or not discussing the fact that we have had these exchanged and, reasons for returning to the FBI. I remember speaking to both Deputy Director, then Deputy Director McCabe and Associate, then Associate Deputy Director Bowditch in the context of when I returned to the FBI and my placement in the Human Resources Division. You mean your demotion to the Human Resources Division. But I can't give you a specific answer to whom else I might have discussed the text with. How about after they were made public? Yes, the same answer. I could not give you a list of people. There were folks obviously who were aware of it, a large number of folks, expressing support. Surely you must remember some of them. Sure, yes I do. I remember a lot of people being very supportive and reaching out and saying, hey, hang in there and things of that nature. So yes, it was obviously very well publicized and known. So are there texts on personal devices that haven't been produced to the Inspector General or to Congress? Not that I'm aware of, but I don't know whether they were personal or not. Not that I'm aware of, and I don't know the status of the IG's work. Goldman, 1 second. Discussion off the record. Goodlatte. Are there texts or emails or other written communications with anyone else inside or outside the Department of Justice or the Federal Bureau of Investigation with whom you've had a personal relationship of a nature similar to the relationship you have had with Lisa Page? No. None whatsoever? If you're implying an extramarital or romantic relationship? Correct. No. You were asked, I think, by the majority regarding FBI morale. Yes, sir. Goodlatte. Related to this. After the Comey announcement of the decision not to indict former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, were there expressions of low morale that you received from anybody in the department related to that announcement and decision? Sir, I wouldn't characterize it as low morale. I think it is absolutely fair to say there were a significant number of agents who either disagreed or didn't understand the reasoning behind the decision not to charge her or with the decision to make a statement about it. But I would not characterize those concerns or questions. I would not at all equate those with low morale. How about generalized grumblings within the ranks? Remember, the FBI is technically, or at least majority, a conservative law enforcement division. They look at things from a law enforcement perspective. So how could the rank and file look at the way the mid-year exam investigation went and not feel like the FBI was made to look like a fool? Just asking, Strozk. Chairman Goodlatte. And how about after the decision made by Director Comey to reopen the investigation and the announcement through a letter to me and others to reopen the investigation just days before the presidential election? What kind of expressions were made to you by others regarding their attitude towards that at that time? I don't recall any specific statements. My recollection of the general sense was this case just keeps continuing, and it was neither a morale thing at all. I wouldn't even say it's positive or negative, other than, oh, wow, we're still here, still with this case. But that's a general sense, Mr. Chairman, not a specific text or any conversation. You indicated that you were surprised and stunned by the firing of Director Comey. Yes. Did you ever speak to the Deputy Attorney General or anyone in his office regarding your reaction to the Deputy Attorney General's comments reinforcing the decision to terminate Director Comey? Not to my recollection. Did you review those comments by the Deputy Attorney General? Yes, I read them. If you're talking about the material that he provided to the White House that was used and released in the context of the reasoning for the firing of Director Comey, correct. Yes, I read them. And what was your reaction to that? My reaction? I had two reactions, Mr. Chairman. The first was the kind of independent assessment of the Deputy Attorney General about the precedential nature of what Director Comey had done, and his assessment of that, and whether or not I thought that was a valid assessment. And then my second reaction was, well, what did you think? Did you think it was valid or not? Why not answer that? Why put it in such an either-or statement to cover your ass? And then my second reaction was, particularly in the face of the statements by President Trump to Lester Holt, to Russian diplomats, that the reason he had fired Mr. Comey had nothing to do with the rationale in the Deputy Attorney General's letter and everything to do with the Russia investigations, gave me great pause about what the reasoning truly was behind Director Comey's firing. Well, here's news for you, Strozk. Trump didn't have to have any reason to fire Comey. He could just say, you're fired, and that's the end of it. So your opinion, your conjecture as to what he meant by it has no bearing on anything. Goodlatte. Getting back to this issue regarding Trump, you can smell the Trump supporters. Oh, come on, Goodlatte, why? You can smell the Trump supporters. What are the different demographics between Northern Virginia and Southern Virginia that would allow you to smell the difference? Sir, again, smells the analogy that I pulled. It could have easily been see, heard. What I observed from my very quick text, which was not at all a scientific description, was that my observation was the area that I was in, central Southern Virginia, was almost exclusively and very demonstrably pro-Trump from the number of signs in front of homes and bumper stickers, and was very much different from my experience here in Northern Virginia, where it was much more evenly split population. And my observation was simply, we're the same state, we're 100 or however many miles apart, and it is radically different. Just that was striking to me. Goodlatte. Now, you also testified earlier that the existence of these texts could never have been used to blackmail you. Why do you say that? Because, sir, I am not. My sense of duty, my devotion to this nation. If you or anybody else came to me and said, Pete, I'm aware of your extramarital affair, and I have all these texts, and I'm going to do whatever it is, unless you do this, I would not do that. That love of my country and my sense of who I am could not be bought, let alone bought by someone like this, that, again, I absolutely regret, that caused extraordinary pain to my family. Again, he leaves out Page. But the notion that something like that could be used to turn me against my country is absurd. Isn't that a very common consideration by not just the Department of Justice and the FBI when they do background checks on all kinds of applicants for all kinds of positions all across our government? Strozk, it is a consideration, but I would say a couple of things. One, in my experience, successful recruitments, whether by the United States or whether by a foreign adversary, has rarely been, in my experience, through blackmail about an affair. It occurs, but it's not frequent. It doesn't matter if it's frequent or not. If you can use it, you can use it. So that distinction means nothing. The other thing, Strozk continues, I may be being a little cynical, but if you look at the number of people in the government who have or are having affairs, I would think that would cast some problems with your proposition. Goodlatte. Well, not with the impact of it, because obviously that's why these questions are asked. If you were asked that question for review for a new position with the government, a promotion, or a transfer to another agency or department or appointment to a position that required confirmation by the United States Senate, how would you have answered that question? It's on every form. Sir, what I would answer is truthfully, and I would to the extent that and I don't know. I would have to review the SF-86 form to see how that's worded. But certainly with regard to, your hypothetical of a confirmation hearing, to say what I said here, I deeply regret the relationship, the affair, and the pain that it's caused my family, and I always will. And I take responsibility for that. And I'm seeking to make amends and make things right where I've caused pain in my personal life. Good lad. Would you acknowledge that that would be grounds for suspending a security clearance? I don't think it would be grounds for suspending a security clearance. I think it's one of a mosaic. Good lad. Really? Strozk, I think it is one of a mosaic of factors that would be taken into account. Sir, I am personally familiar with a number of individuals who have had extramarital affairs who retain, after knowledge of that has become known, who've retained their clearances. So it is a factor, but it is not the sole determinant factor. So what would you say are those other factors? I think there are a host. Again, the people who do security clearances are very professional, and they have a set of guidelines. But I think a wide variety of things from, I don't even want to speculate down the list, but financial exposure, alcoholism, gambling problems, there are a host of things that go into the consideration about the determination to grant a clearance. Good lad. So are you a registered voter in the Commonwealth of Virginia? I'm an independent, sir. But you're registered to vote. This question came up earlier. I am registered to vote, and what I couldn't recall in Virginia is whether or not you have to register as an independent to not. Good lad. There's no party registration in Virginia. I know that very well. Strozk. I believe I will. Good lad. So no party registration, but you are registered to vote in Virginia. Yes, sir. Okay. So do you generally vote in elections? Yes, I do. Consistently? Yes. General elections and primaries? General elections, certainly. Primaries, it varies. Important primaries, like presidential primaries? Yes. Did you vote in the presidential primary in 2016? I did. And which party did you cast a vote in? Strozk. Sir, I see a bedrock of our democracy being the privacy of an individual's vote, and I don't think it's appropriate at all. I'll have to go along with that. A secret ballot is part of our democracy. I really don't think that is if that's a question good lad asked, which party did you cast a vote in? I guess it's not technically the same as what was the individual vote, but still it's kind of pushy. I don't agree with that line of questioning. Again, my opinion. Good lad. I didn't ask who you voted for. I asked which primary you voted in. Strozk. Because again, you would know better than I don't know if Virginia. I think you may be allowed to vote in both, but I don't recall. No, you're not allowed to vote in both. You have to pick. Yes, and I don't recall. If I voted, I believe I voted in the Democratic primary because I did not vote in the Republican primary, but I'm not certain I voted in the Democratic primary. So I did. I don't remember. Wait, I did. I don't remember. If I did, I think I did this because I didn't do that, but I'm not certain I did this. Good lad. Yet earlier you said you were considering voting for John Kasich. I was. All right. But if you decided to vote in the Democratic primary, John Kasich would not have been on the ballot in that primary. That's right. Was he still in the race? Yeah. I don't know if he was. Yeah, sir. That's a good question. I don't know if Governor Kasich was in the race at the time of the primary or not. Good lad. All right. In a Supreme Court case handed down just last year, the court reviewed whether statements made by a juror that indicated racial bias required the piercing of jury deliberations. Justice Kennedy wrote the opinion of the court holding that racial bias exhibited by a juror provided an exception to the rule that jury deliberations must remain confidential because it is necessary to ensure that our legal system remains capable of coming ever closer to the promise of equal treatment under the law that is so central to a functioning democracy. On several occasions, you have referenced that the texts in your questions were simply personal opinions exchanged with a close confidant and in no way reflected your intent to act on your opinions. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Yet, if you made those statements while on a jury, it is hard to imagine that you would not be kicked off immediately because of the risk that your bias would undermine a functioning democracy, to quote Justice Kennedy. Do you still hold that personal opinions, even in the face of the Supreme Court precedent, should not have tainted your involvement in any investigation relating to Secretary Clinton or President Trump? Strozk. Sir, I don't think that Supreme Court decision applies at all. I think you're talking about apples and oranges. I think the Supreme Court decision is talking about opinions about protected classes, race, religion, sexual orientation, things that by law you must not take into account. I see that as entirely different from political belief, which is not only specifically enumerated in the First Amendment, saying you're entitled to it, but that this very body held in passing the Hatch Act that there are things which in the interest of a functioning government you're not allowed to do, and anything else not only is allowed, but it's encouraged. Now, he is in Virginia. I mean, he lives in Virginia, but he's standing in D.C. right now. And in D.C., it is against the law to discriminate against someone based on political belief. So it's out there, Peter. It's out there. So when it comes to political opinion, Strozk continues, that is something that our nation, through the Constitution, has said we, unless specifically prohibited, want to encourage everybody, government employee or not, to engage in, which is very, very different from a protected class of race, sexual orientation, gender, or anything else. And one more thing, sir, I disagree with you. You've said just now, and before that you make this equivalence, that political opinion equals bias, and I couldn't disagree more. I have political opinions. I do not have bias, because bias implies act, and I have never acted on the basis of any of my political opinion. Good lad. So you're sitting in a jury box, and there's a lawsuit involving President Trump, and you have before you, or candidate Trump before, because most of this occurred before he was elected president, right? Most of the comments you made, he was not president of the United States. You have an attorney before you who reads to the judge the comments you've made repeatedly over many months' period of time, reflecting what some of us would characterize as hatefulness or animus, and you do not think that judge would order you struck from that jury? Strozk. Sir, I can't put myself in the hypothetical of what would happen in that event. So in other words, you have the brain capacity of a mayfly. In the context of if that same attorney had followed each of the jurors home and listened to their conversations over a backyard barbecue where they discussed, good lad, no, that didn't happen here, Strozk, but this is the analogy, sir, no. If they were to get those personal opinions and read the thinking, everybody has a personal opinion, sir, whether you're in your mind or writing it, good lad. Everybody has a personal opinion. Everybody has a personal opinion. But the personal opinion is weighed by the court to determine whether or not they can give a fair and impartial decision in a case that's before them. Do you believe that a judge acting in those circumstances would view the comments that you made, and knowing that you made them in private, not thinking they would ever be made public, that judge would leave you on that jury? Sir, I can't answer that question. Okay, thank you. Those are all the questions I have. Take a drink here. We're on the home stretch, folks. Mr. Ratcliffe, Agent Strozk, I was asking you about when the decision was made not to charge Hillary Clinton, and we were talking about a text exchange between you and Lisa Page on July the 1st, where she related that the Attorney General was hardly a profile in courage, since she knows she, meaning Hillary Clinton, is not going to be charged. Do you recall that? I do. Okay. As it turns out, the very next day, July 2nd, is the day that Hillary Clinton was interviewed, correct? I believe the 2nd or the 3rd, but the 2nd sounds right, sir. Saturday, July the 2nd. Yes. And you were part of that interview team. I was. How many folks from the FBI and DOJ attended Secretary Clinton's interview? There were 3 from the FBI, and there were 5 from DOJ. Who were the 3 from the FBI? Me and 2 case agents. Who were the 5 from the Department of Justice? Dave Laufman, who's a section chief, and then 4 non-ESs, 2 AUSAs from EDVA, and 2 NSD attorneys. Mr. Ratcliffe. Okay, so 8 folks from the Department of Justice and the FBI. A total of 8, yes. A total of 8, okay. Do you recall what prompted that text exchange earlier that week between you and Ms. Page? I think it was the announcement by the then Attorney General following, I believe it was following the meeting she had with President Clinton on the tarmac, that she was going to accept the recommendations of the FBI as to the charging decision. Right, and probably the most famous tarmac meeting in American history. I'm not an expert on tarmac meetings, but it certainly was notable. That's pretty funny. Ratcliffe, do you recall, let's put it in context, Do you recall that Director Comey called that tarmac meeting a game changer? The reason that he held a press conference without the Department of Justice. I don't recall him using. I remember him saying the word game changer. I don't recall. He may well have said it in regard to that. I do know that it was certainly very significant consideration in his, Ratcliffe. Do you recall the Attorney General testifying before Congress and admitting that that meeting cast a shadow over the Department of Justice? I don't recall that, but I'll take your representation of it. Okay, well, do you recall a text message with Ms. Page that weekend where you described it as stupid, stupid, stupid on June the 30th? I think that's right, but I just want to read the context. Well, regardless of what the text says, it's June the 30th. I think that's Lisa Page saying that, sir. Okay, regard. And my point about being the most famous tarmac meeting, much of the country was speculating about what happened and what was said in that meeting. Yes, I was too. Got a lot of media attention? It did. All right. Do you know what was said in that meeting? I don't. So 5 days after that meeting, that I'll represent to you, Jim Comey, called a game changer, and that the Attorney General said cast a shadow, you went in with 8 folks from the Department of Justice to interview Mrs. Clinton. Strozk, I went in with 7, but there were 8 of us, yes. Okay. And that wasn't a recorded interview. That's correct. All right. But do we have a 302? And for those of you who may not remember from the other day, a 302 is shorthand for the interview form that agents fill out after they've interviewed a subject that puts down basically the notes of the meeting after the fact. They don't normally take notes during the questioning, but they write out the 302 afterwards. Okay, have you had a chance to review? Excuse me. All right, but do we have a 302? Yes, sir. Okay, have you had a chance to review the 302? Not recently, no, sir. Okay, but at any point in time? Oh, yes, sir. Okay, this is my only copy, so I'd like to get it back. But tell me where in that 302 there's a discussion with Hillary Clinton about the tarmac meeting. Sir, so this is the LHM summary of this investigation, and LHM stands for Letterhead Memorandum. LHM summary of the investigation, not the 302. But I'll stipulate to you having a copy of the 302. My recollection is that I would need to review that 302 to see if we asked about that or not. I don't recall we did or not. Ratcliffe, well, you told me earlier, I asked you the question, do you know what was said in that meeting? And you said no. I do not know what was said in that meeting. I'll represent to you the 302 doesn't reference the word tarmac anywhere. So my question to you is, if 8 of the Department of Justice and FBI truth seekers were in a room with Hillary Clinton about a meeting that everyone in the country was talking about that had happened 5 days earlier, why didn't she get asked a single question about the meeting between her husband and their boss at the Department of Justice? That's a hell of a question. Sir, I'm not certain that she wasn't. I would need to. It may be the case, but I don't recall at this point. And I would need to look at the 302 and talk with the folks in the room to see whether or not we did and what she said and the reasoning behind it. I just don't remember that fact and whether or not it was asked or not. Okay, so time and time again, Strozk will allow, quote-unquote, the representation as made by the congressperson. Yet this time, when Ratcliffe has him cornered and has stated that it's not on the 302, that tarmac is not anywhere on the 302, suddenly Strozk says, since he doesn't remember it, he can't take that as fact. It's a cornered rat. Strozk, sir, I'm not certain that she wasn't. I would need to. It may be the case, but I don't recall at this point. And I would need to look at the 302 and talk with the folks in the room to see whether or not we did and what she said and the reasoning behind it. I just don't remember that fact, whether or not it was asked or not. Whether it was asked about or not. Ratcliffe, again, you already told me that you don't know what was said in that meeting. I do not know what was said in the meeting on the tarmac. That's correct. Okay, so if Attorney General Lynch talked to the subject's husband, Bill Clinton, about serving as the Attorney General in a Clinton administration, how would we know that? I do not know how we'd know that, sir. Well, they could have talked about that. I don't want to speculate. It's possible they could have talked about anything, but I have no idea what they did or didn't talk about. Ratcliffe, but if they talked about anything, wouldn't it be reflected in the 302? Secretary Clinton was not a part of that conversation. President Clinton was. Yeah. If a question was asked, what does the 302 do for the benefit of the folks reading this transcript? 302 records the statements of the interview of the person being interviewed. And would it record all of the topics covered? Yes. And if a topic included a discussion about a tarmac conversation between the subject's husband and the boss of 5 of the people that walked in that room, would that be in the 302? It would be. And if it's not, would that reflect that no question was asked about that topic? That is a possible explanation for it. That's a hypothetical. You can't... Boy, when you get into hypotheticals with Strozk, he just falls apart. That's a hypothetical, and that is Ratcliffe. What other explanation would there be? That's hard to answer. I would want to review that 302 and talk to the agents because honestly, Congressman, I don't remember whether or not that was asked or not sitting here now. And if it wasn't, Congressman, I would note to you the purpose of our investigation was to understand how classified information came to be placed on her server. It was not to talk about the staffing of her administration. It was not to talk about the Clinton Foundation. It was not to talk about the price of tea in Chappaqua. None of which Ratcliffe brought up. It was to understand the circumstances by which she set up a private server and how classified information came to be placed on that server. So there's no reason you would ask in front of the DOJ if she knew anything about a deal being made between her husband and the Attorney General. That wouldn't be an appropriate question at all, you don't think? Strozk continues. So our interview and the scope of that interview was to address those concerns. And what we don't do this is very much a standard procedure. We're going to go into that interview to ask the matter about which we are investigating. If we have allegations of another crime, of course, we might ask about that. But you did. But at this point, the optics of what I believe to be a very ill-advised meeting on the tarmac were not indicia of illegal activity. So for us to get into a discussion, as I think about it, we may have asked. You're saying we didn't. My sense is, if we did not ask, it's because it had nothing to do with the matter and facts we were investigating. But you're telling us under oath that 8 folks from the Department of Justice and FBI wouldn't think it was important to ask a question of the subject's husband having a meeting with their boss. Goldman, just for the record, he's not under oath, Congressman. Strozk, I'm saying to you that it is not at all true that we did not see it as important or relevant. Ratcliffe, you just answered a question about it. Strozk, without talking to the team about what the reasoning about asking that or not, I can't give you a definitive answer. My sense, and I'm doing the very dangerous thing of speculating, my sense is that we focused on that interview on the facts at hand in the investigation. But I would defer to talking to the team because, again, it's been a couple of years, and Jordan, well, just a quick follow-up. I didn't plan on asking this. Was it more important than the price of tea in Chappaqua? Congressman, good afternoon. Yes, absolutely it was more important. I don't know that, again, with regard to the relevance of the question, as to why Secretary Clinton set up a private server and whether or not classified information came to be placed there, whether or not she knew that and her involvement. Okay, which she did, it did, and she did. Jordan, did you ask about the price of tea in Chappaqua at that interview with Secretary Clinton? No, we did not. No, you didn't. But you can't tell us whether you asked about the fact that her husband just met with the Attorney General just 2 days before your interview. That's a body slam. Strozk, Congressman, what I'm saying to you is I don't recall asking about that, and I don't know whether we did or didn't. If we did not, it was my assumption because we were focused on the gravamen of the case and the investigation. When did you first get a chance to look at the dossier? Strozk, I think I defer to FBI counsel as to whether or not I can answer that question. Jordan, it's been, the dossier, the whole darn thing has been printed in the press. I just want to know when you first saw it. Strozk, that's true, and that's a different question. Bessie, Congressman, what's printed in the press may not be accurate. It may not be what he was privy to, so I would not allow him to answer that question. Jordan, have you read the dossier? I have. You have? I have, yes. When did you first read it? Again, that gets into a level of investigative detail about an ongoing investigation that I don't think the FBI or the special counsel want me to answer. I'm happy to answer it, but I defer to what I think the appropriate FBI equities are in this regard. Bessie, Congressman, I would not allow him to answer that question because it gets into the special counsel's investigation. Jordan, I'm not asking about the special counsel. We've been through this. I'm not asking about the special counsel investigation. I'm asking about what you all did in the Russia investigation that was launched in late July. I want to know when you first had access to the dossier and when you first looked at it. Bessie, the FBI investigation was subsumed into the special counsel's investigation. So anything that Mr. Strozk did on the investigation while it was under the FBI's purview would still be a part of the special counsel's investigation. Jordan, did you read it all at once, Mr. Strozk, or did you read it in parts? Strozk, again, sir, same answer. I don't think I can tell you about the timing and manner I read it without getting into details about the investigation. I am happy. There's a very straightforward answer that I'm happy to provide, but the FBI practice, which I believe and understand and support, is that we do not talk about ongoing investigations. Jordan, did you ever communicate with Christopher Steele? Bessie, Congressman, that's another question I would instruct the witness not to answer. All I'm asking is if he ever talked to him. It goes into his responsibility as an agent on the investigation itself, so it would still... Jordan, did you ever talk to Glenn Simpson? Good lad. Let me interrupt you because I think this is very important. We have an investigation going on here into the disparate handling of the Hillary Clinton investigation and the so-called Trump-Russia collusion investigation. And we're entitled to know answers, not about anything substantive found in that investigation, but we're entitled to have answers about how Mr. Strozk, who was a central player in that investigation, handled his own responsibilities and what he did or didn't do, not related to the substance, but related to the process and form. And I think that this question is entirely appropriate. Bessie, Mr. Chairman, my position would still remain the same, because while it is a part of your investigation, it does impact what the special counsel is doing. I fail to see how. There are other times where I see how they don't have a good foundation to ask the question without getting into the substance of the investigation, but I don't see how this matters. When did you read it? Did you read it in parts or did you read it in whole? I don't see how that can't be answered. I'm not a lawyer. I could be completely off base, but that's the way I read this. I'll read Bessie again. Mr. Chairman, my position would still remain the same because while it is a part of your investigation, it does impact what the special counsel is doing, and we would have to confer with the special counsel in order to be able to appropriately respond to your question. Good lad. Whether or not he talked to somebody before the special counsel was even appointed? Bessie, he talked. Good lad. We're not even asking what he talked to him about. We're just asking whether he talked to him. Bessie, Mr. Chairman, the fact that he would have talked to him would have been as a result of him being an investigator in that specific, good lad. Maybe, maybe not. Mr. Steele has been involved in other matters for the FBI. Has he not? Bessie, and it would still go to whether, again, if it is an ongoing or if the FBI has other investigations. I don't know that we can sort of confirm or deny any such thing. So I would still instruct him not to answer that question until we confer with the special counsel. Chairman Goodlatte. Well, you can be sure we will. I would prefer not to involve the special counsel since we have, Jordan. Agent Strozk? Goodlatte. Clearly attempted to stay away from that. Jordan. Agent Strozk, who paid for the dossier? Sir, under guidance from agency counsel, I am not able to answer that question. Jordan. The whole world knows who paid for it. I'm asking you, do you know who paid for it? Strozk. Again, under direction from agency counsel, I can't answer that question. Bessie. If Mr. Strozk learned that information as part of his duties investigating or participating in the investigation, I would instruct him not to answer. Goodlatte. So is it the position of the Department of Justice under federal investigation that you're going to stonewall answers to questions that do not go to the substance of Mr. Mueller's work? Because we have, for months now, investigated what the events were leading up to that without ever asking questions about the investigation has found with regard to Trump-Russia collusion. Bessie. Mr. Chairman, I'm not in a position to really tell you what will or will not impact Mr. Mueller's investigation since I'm not part of that. So I cannot have the witness answer questions that may impact the investigation without knowing for sure from the special counsel that it will not impact Goodlatte. So if Mr. Jordan asks the witness, have you ever met Robert Mueller? Are you going to allow him to answer that question? Bessie, yes, because Mr. Mueller was also once the FBI director. Goodlatte, right. So the question that we just asked was related to an individual who has worked for the FBI for many years. Why can't he answer that question? Bessie, I don't believe that individual was an employee. Steele was paid by the FBI, folks. I think that makes him at least a contractor. Mr. Mueller and Mr. Steele are in two different levels, so I would not compare the two. Jordan, Agent Strozk, ever communicate with Glenn Simpson? Sir, I think it's the same answer. Jordan, it's not even close. It's not even close. Christopher Steele was, hang on, if you could, Mr. Chairman, please, it's not even close. Glenn Simpson is not former MI6. Glenn Simpson is a journalist. Did you ever talk to Glenn Simpson? May I answer that question? Bessie, may we confer? Goodlatte, yes. I just want to say, and I'm going to leave because I've got to go somewhere else, But all of these questions will be raised with the Director and with the Deputy Attorney General of the United States tomorrow morning if we're not getting answers today. Bessie, sure, Mr. Chairman. Discussion off the record. Bessie, Congressman, any questions that relate to Mr. Strozk's involvement in the investigation of the Russian collusion that's under the purview of the Special Counsel, I will instruct him not to answer. Of course, if the Director or the Deputy Attorney General make a different decision, or the Special Counsel makes a different decision, then we can answer those questions. But for right now, I will instruct the witness not to answer as it relates to that ongoing investigation. Jordan, did you ever talk to Bruce Orr? Good lad. Let me say one more thing. So we're going to have this discussion publicly or privately with those individuals, and we will subpoena Mr. Strozk to return and answer the questions at a time that's appropriate because we feel very strongly we are entitled to his answers. Mr. Jordan, Agent Strozk, did you ever talk to Bruce Orr? On advice of agency counsel, I've been told not to answer that question. Holy cow. I'm sorry, Mr. Jordan. Holy cow. He works in the Justice Department. He does. Never talked to him? Strozk, may I answer that question? Bessie, you can answer that question. I have. Jordan, when? Strozk, without looking at my calendar, it would be difficult for me to tell you. My recollection is I met him either 2 or 3 times in 2016 and 2017. I know I have not seen him this year, but those 3 meetings I'd have to refer to my calendar. What'd you talk about? May I answer that question? Bessie, if the conversations did not involve anything relating to an ongoing or possible investigation. Jordan, you talked to him in 2016 and 2017? What did you talk about? You said 3 times. So, Congressman, let me refresh my recollection on that as I think about it and make sure I'm absolutely accurate about that. Sir, I talked to him in 2016 and 2017 as I indicated, and based on the direction of agency counsel, I cannot discuss the content of our discussions. Jordan, ever talk with Nellie Orr? No. Agency counsel may get angry with me, but no. Jordan, so you can't answer that. She worked for Glenn Simpson. Fusion. You can tell me you didn't talk to her, but you can't tell me you won't answer whether you talked to Glenn Simpson. With Glenn Simpson. Strozk. Sir, I was answering that question in the context of her being Bruce Orr's wife. Jordan. Well, I know she's Bruce Orr's wife, but she also worked for Glenn Simpson and Fusion. You're saying you never talked to her. I did say that, and that's accurate. All right? I'll yield because we've only got 10 minutes. I'm going to yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, but I may want to jump back in. Meadows. So let me go fairly quickly. Towards the end of July 2016, there's a text message between you and Lisa Page talking about, do you want me to reach out to Gervais Greg? Well, it says Gervais. I assume it's Gervais Greg. My understanding, it's pronounced Gervais. Huh? Gervais. Okay, yeah, so Gervais Greg. Do you know who that is? I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's spelled the same way every time. So if it's not Gervais, if it's Gervais, I'm getting it wrong, but it looks like Gervais to me. My apologies, Senor Greg. Okay, yeah, so Gervais Greg. Do you know who that is? I do, Meadows. And so what is Mr. Greg in charge of? At the time, I believe he was involved in the Bureau's interface with the election and the transition offices of folks. Meadows. Electronic surveillance and so forth? Strozk. No. At the time, he does something currently with regard to that, I think, in the lab. But at the time the Bureau had an office set up to deal with initially both the nominees, and that whoever won the election, that then the FBI's interface for providing them briefings and things of that sort, he ran that effort, is my recollection. Meadows. Yeah. So there was another text message, and you said, well, why should you reach out to him? And I think Lisa Page just says, we want to see if he has the 5 names already. What would that be in reference to? Do you recall? Sir, what's the date of those texts? I don't recall offhand. Meadows. July 29th, 2016. It's a redacted form, but in the redaction it would say, or just ask if he has the names already, was under the redaction on it. Goldman. What time, Congressman? Meadows. It would have been at 23/17/11, so 11/17 at night. Strozk. So do you have a copy of the unredacted version? Sir, my recollection was that, Meadows, why would you be reaching out to him in regards to your investigation of either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? Why would you be reaching out to Mr. Strozk? It was not in regard to either of those investigations. My recollection in dealing with him was that we were providing and coordinating counterintelligence briefings to both of the candidates and their staffs, and part of that was determining who it was from the campaign that was going to receive those briefings. And because he had that role on kind of the transition team staff, he was the person that would know it. My assumption, and again this is only an assumption, is it was redacted because it's irrelevant to either the Clinton investigation or the Russian influence investigations. Meadows. Yeah, and perhaps so. But that, since we don't have a privilege log, we wouldn't know that. But let me go on a little bit further. You mentioned that you didn't show any bias because you didn't act on that earlier. Is that correct? Sir, no. I don't think that's what I said. I said, Meadows, so would you. Strozk, I said I do not have bias. That political belief and opinion is something that is different and distinct from bias. And I don't agree with the analogy that if you have opinion, therefore you're biased that way. And what I said about bias was in response to, well, what makes bias, and my belief that bias is when somebody is acting on those beliefs. I don't agree with that at all. Bias is bias. You don't have to act on your bias in order to have it. If you do act on it, then you're prejudiced. In my opinion. I could be parsing that too closely. I'm not, I do have fairly high verbal skills, but I'm not the guy who wrote the thesaurus in the dictionary, but that's just how I see it, for what it's worth. Strozk, I said I do not have bias, that political belief and opinion is something that is different and distinct from bias. And I don't agree with the analogy that if you have opinion, therefore you're biased that way. And what I said about bias was in response to, well, what makes bias and my belief that bias is when somebody is acting on those beliefs. We all have political beliefs, every one of us in this room. Meadows, sure. Strozk, and that doesn't make us biased. Meadows. So would you agree with the Inspector General's report that you prioritize the Russia investigation over the Hillary Clinton investigation? Would you agree or disagree with that? I disagree with that conclusion. So you didn't prioritize it. I did not prioritize in that it was not a binary decision. There was not I'm moving resources from this Clinton case to this Trump case, or vice versa. If I may, sir, Meadows. So the 30-day window where you didn't look at the Anthony Weiner laptop was just because it didn't float back up to the top? Sir, I'm glad you asked that. What I would like to draw you to are the facts of what happened. Meadows, no, I know the facts. Strozk, within hours of finding out about that, Meadows, hold on just a second and I'll let you answer. I'll let you answer before your counsel takes back your mic. So if you can keep your answer succinct, because we've got limited time. Strozk, yeah, absolutely, sir. I disagree with both the Inspector General's broad suggestion and yours just now that I waited. If you look at what the record reflects, Meadows, mine was a question. Strozk, it was an immediate action on my part to assign supervisors and their subordinate agents and analysts to follow up. I did that within hours, and they followed up within hours. And they were left at that time the understanding that New York would, that the material was crashing, hadn't finished processing, and that New York was going to let them know when it happened. My experience is that processing computer evidence is like black magic. It can take 2 days, it can take 2 months. And so I do not find that unreasonable at all. Meadows, all right. So Mr. Pientka, Agent Pientka works for you. Is that how you would say his name? Sir, I don't want to get into non-SES personnel. Meadows, does he work for you? I mean, I'm giving you the name, and it showed up in some of your text messages. So does Mr. Pientka work for you? This is a confidential briefing of which that answer is critical. Does he work for you? Bessie, Congressman, the Director has not authorized us to acknowledge the names or to divulge the names of agents or employees who are not at SES level. So that specific question, Meadows. But where in statute does it say that you have to have that ability to do that and keep that from Congress? Is there anywhere in statute that gives you the right to do that, Counselor? Congressman, it may not be in a statute, but I believe it's based on, Meadows, fine. All right, let me go on a little further since we're out of time. Mr. Pientka worked for you. I will make that assumption based on org charts and what we have. Are you aware of any time that 302s were modified, changed, or adapted? Strozk, sir, I am, Meadows, with regard to either investigation. Sir, without making any representation about the names you were throwing out there, my experience is that every 302 in the course of being drafted is a collaborative effort between the people who conducted that interview and I. It is the rare, unusual example of a 302 that is not edited and revised in the course of the drafting of that. Meadows, there are allegations that you instructed Mr. Pientka to change 302 that would materially have altered either a prosecutorial or the lack thereof decision in that. Would you deny those claims? Strozk, sir, what I would say, and I think I can answer your question without any specifics, is I did not, have not, in the course of drafting any 302, make any change or do anything other than ensure that 302 was an accurate representation of the statements of the person being interviewed. Meadows, okay. The IC that started this, the intelligence community, the IC under earlier questioning, you said you don't recall ever being told that there were anomalies in the metadata when they came in to alert you of the case or their concern about potential foreign invasion into the Hillary Clinton server. Is that correct? Sir, what I think I said is I do not recall being aware personally of that. I would not be the logical person on the team. We had a variety of forensic experts whose job it was, Meadows, right, but we have people, Strozk, to look at things like that, and that then they would bring that to the team, to Mr. Maffa, and have my attention if there were anomalies or anything unusual or of note in the course of the investigation. Meadows, but my understanding was you were in the initial meeting when they brought this to the attention of you and others, and that you were in the initial meeting. And then the last contact they had with you was 10 minutes after the exoneration speech by Director Comey, that you called them back to say close out the case and give the proper paperwork for closing out the referral. Is that not accurate? Sir, I do not recall a meeting where the ICIG made any reference to changes in the metadata. Meadows, Mr. McCullough, Mr. Strozk. What I can tell you, Congressman, is that our technical experts, any allegation of intrusion, any review of metadata that might be indicative of an act, was pursued by our technical folks, and I am very confident that they did that thoroughly and well. I am certainly unaware of anything that we did not pursue or had not pursued. Meadows, did you ever use devices, either your personal or your official devices, in a capacity to try to keep information from being detected by others? From others. Strozk, yes, from my spouse. Okay, how about from others that might be willing to investigate at a later date? No. There are text messages which suggest that devices were used in such a way as to not allow them to be recoverable, and you're saying that's not accurate. Strozk, I do not recall ever using it to prevent it from being recovered, in the official work-type communication to prevent it from being recovered. No. Jordan, one quick question, Agent Strozk. When a FISA application is put together, what is the typical time frame it takes to compile that application so that it's ready to go to the FISA court? Strozk, again, my experience is that it varies wildly. I've seen FISA applications go through within a day, and I've seen some literally take years. Mr. Jordan, and any time frame reference you can give us on the FISA application that was taken to the court to get the warrant for Carter Page, how long did that one take to put together? Was it a day or was it a year? Strozk, so first off, I think any discussion of any specific FISA becomes classified, and then I defer to agency counsel if that's something Jordan, I'm not asking about specifics. Again, I'm asking, how long did it take to put together? Strozk, sir, I wouldn't. I think it's threading close to classified information to talk about the time frame for a specific FISA, but one, and I defer to agency counsel, I understand we're looking at Jordan, did you ever talk to George Papadopoulos? Strozk, sir, that's squarely in the realm of the area that agency counsel has directed me not to speak about. Jordan, thank you. Meadows, so agent, let me go back. Are you aware of any surveillance, any confidential informants, confidential human sources, which obviously are two different things, that shared information with the FBI during the month of July? Strozk, yes, I'm aware of. The Bureau term now, we had a variety over the years, but the current term is confidential human sources. I think you're talking about human sources. Yes, I'm aware of CHSs who provided information to the Bureau in the month of July. I assume you mean 16, but every July. Meadows, 2016, yes, thanks. Strozk, yes. Meadows, so at that point, was there an ongoing investigation that we now know as Crossfire Hurricane? Was that ongoing at that point? It was in late, well, two things, sir. I'm not going to comment on the name of what investigation may or may not have been, because again, that's classified. Meadows, I think the FBI leaked it to the New York Times, but we'll leave it at that, so whatever it may be. So, at this point, you are saying that there were confidential human sources, plural, that you had information from during the month of July. Strozk, sir, I want to say this, and I know nobody in this chamber would ever take anything out of context and repeat it in the media, but to be very clear, of the thousands of cases that I had oversight responsibility of, I was aware in those thousands of cases, Meadows, I'm talking specifically, Strozk, there were CHSs providing information. I am not making any representation whatsoever whether or not there were CHSs providing information about the Russian influence investigation. Meadows, well, obviously, that's where you were the lead investigator. Strozk, I know it clearly is not, Meadows, and it seemed like it was going, so let me go ahead and make that distinction. In the month of July, was there any information from confidential human sources given to you as it relates to the Russia investigation? Following advice of counsel, I can't answer that question. It's answerable, but I, under advice of agency counsel, I can't answer that. Meadows. Did you get any of that in June? Again, same answer. All right. Did you ever give information to Christopher Steele? Same answer. What do you mean, same answer? Same answer. Under direction by agency counsel, I cannot answer that question. And what reason is that? Counsel? Bessie. Congressman, anything that relates to an ongoing investigation, that's Meadows. Well, I would like to point out to the counsel that the investigation I'm talking about concluded because there's a new investigation. The special counsel actually started a new independent investigation. Investigation, mind you. And so the investigation I'm talking about was the one that actually concluded. So are you maintaining the same argument? Bessie, which investigation are you saying concluded, Congressman? Meadows, well, obviously, the investigation that Mr. Strozk was the lead investigator on. He's no longer the lead investigator of an investigation. We have a new independent counsel that's doing a separate investigation, counterintelligence investigation. So at this point, are you suggesting that everything is off limits if Mr. Mueller happens to be looking at anything that Peter Strozk has done? Bessie, my understanding is that it was not concluded. It was subsumed into the special counsel investigation. So it is. It's not that it ended and another one began. That same information became a part of the special counsel investigation, so I would instruct the witness not to answer. Mr. Breitenbach, time is done. Whereupon at 7:22 p.m., the interview concluded in classified session. And that, folks, is that. So let's see. The interview ended at 7:22 p.m. It is 8:15 my time right now. 17 after 8 if you want to be specific. And the interview started at 10:05 a.m. So we did it. We finished this within the time that it took for the question and answer to be completed. With all my rambling. With all my mistakes and corrections. Right? Round of applause, everybody. I think we did really well. Okay, so that's it. That's the Strozk testimony in closed session for the Committee on the Judiciary, U.S. House of Representatives, on Wednesday, June 27, 2018. And if I may be more specific, was held in room 2141 of the Rayburn House Office Building. Now we know. Now, certainly, if there are any questions, anything that you feel I didn't cover properly or that I did incorrectly, please put those in the comments section during any one of the segments that we've recorded today. There are 3 separate segments that we've recorded. I believe the other 2 should have been posted by now, and this one will take probably, I'm just guessing, probably a couple hours to post, maybe longer. We've gone for just over 2 hours and 20 minutes. So we're finished. I believe my voice will hold up enough that I'll be able to do Bruce Orr tomorrow, starting at 9 a.m., same as today. The Bruce Orr testimony is 268 pages, I believe. Let's make sure here. Yes, kitty cat. Yes, 268 pages. So it won't take as long as it did today. That's about 60 pages less. So we should be able to finish not too long after a dinner break. And I'm planning on doing the same breaks tomorrow as I did today. I'll start at 9. I'll go till noon. I'll have lunch. Come back at 12:30. Go till 5:30. Come back at 6. And then read the rest of it from 6 on. Excuse me. Yes, kitty cat. Yes, you've been wonderful. So we'll do that. And again, any questions, put them in the comment section. I may not get to them tonight, but I'll try to get tomorrow, but I'll try to get to them Wednesday or Thursday when I'm going to be out of town. I'll bring my laptop with me. If there are, thank you, Ray. I appreciate it. I appreciate your being here as always. Let me see, Uncle Bobbity, if you're still here, thank you so much. If you're not, my thanks to you anyway. I appreciate your being here. I'd like to thank everybody else who was in the chat today. Jason was in earlier. We had a visit by a Democrat who I feel was not very strong in her argumentation against Trump. I'll leave it at that. You can go back and look at the chat record from this morning, and you can make your own comments on that. I wasn't impressed, but those are her feelings. Excuse me, those are her impressions. Those are her thoughts on the matter. So I'm in no way saying that they're not valid. I just don't agree with any of them. All right. I'll sign off now, and I'll see those of you tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp. And I promise it'll start at 9 o'clock this time. I won't have screwed everything up like I did this morning. It'll work. I guarantee it. Guarantee. All right. Good night, everybody.